Hello, everybody. Welcome back to what is probably going to be a very humid recording section if the heat in Britain is the same where Crofty is as I am.
It really is.
Yeah, I think that was a smart move in our behind, definitely, where rather than recording the second Dragons section for this podcast immediately after the first, let's wait 3 weeks until it's the hottest day of the year so far, and we're trapped in tiny little rooms having to try and record with computers kicking out loads and loads of heat.
I think that was the best idea we've ever had.
Yeah, brilliance, genius. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mythological podcast. Now, last time I spectacularly failed to introduce myself. So, hello, everybody. My name is Charles Snart. I am also known on YouTube as the Histocrat, where I run a little channel devoted to all different types of world history with a focus on British history. Today, we're here to talk about world mythology. In our first episode, we completely overran what we were going to record and ended up having 2 hours of dragons that only got us up to about ancient Greece.
So now we have the unexpected part 2 of dragons.
I'm joined today by noted dragon fancier Andrew the Crofter Crofts, PhD.
Had to get the PhD in there.
Had to get it in. You didn't get paid to do a job for 4 years, essentially, and not get your nice piece of paper at the end of it.
True. But Charles Snart is also a PhD in his own right.
Yeah, I'm really doing justice to that PhD with my newfound YouTube career. That's I joked to someone on Twitter once who I don't think got it, that the second I started putting videos on YouTube is probably the moment that the university should have stepped in and gone, we're taking this back. Clearly it wasn't worth it. You squandered everything we invested in you, and goodbye.
I think it's bad for you. I play the ukulele in pubs, so I think I'm worse.
The shame.
Yeah. Last minute winners, check them out.
Well, one day when this lockdown finally is lifted. So last time we left off, as I said, around the point of ancient Greece. We'd explored the initial origins of dragons both in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and far off China. And now we're going to start moving forward into what I'd call probably the more modern iconography associated with dragons, followed by something of a globe-trotting adventure to see how the world has interpreted dragons, both in the sense of new countries encountering the Western tradition of dragons, and more native interpretations of dragon-like entities. And that's really where we're going to start looking at some of the parallels that are unintentionally that are unintentionally rearing their heads. So, Crofty, before we go any further, I think, having listened back to the previous episode, I kind of cut you off at a certain point when you were telling the story of Susanoo.
Yeah.
The Japanese dragon, because you probably know from me that if I have to listen to something for longer than about 5 minutes, I forget instantly what the other person was saying and want to move on.
Yeah, and so I got cut off before the actual dragon showed up in the dragon story.
Yeah, that was a spectacular move. So, Crofty, I'm going to yield the floor to you and let you continue that story.
Okay. Well, I'll start with just a very brief recap. Susanoo was the Japanese thunder god. He was the brother of Amaterasu, the Japanese sun goddess and queen of the gods. And he was exiled from the heavens because as a thunder god, he was quite destructive. He destroyed forests, ruined mountains, killed local inhabitants down on Earth, and he was banished from the heavens. He also managed to get his sister Amaterasu exiled through a prank that he was making that he claimed was wanting to say goodbye and proving his good intentions. He claimed he would bring into the world 5 new deities, and if they turned out to be male, it would prove his honesty. He took a jewel necklace from his sister, ate the jewels from it, and spat them out, which gave birth to 5 male deities. And these, along with 3 female gods that Amaterasu produced when she ate Susanoo's sword, became the ancestors of the Japanese nobility, though they're not too important to the dragon story, but it's a nice bit of background. And so after being being exiled from the heavens, he went on another rampage, destroying rice fields and people again, and apparently even flayed a divine horse and threw it into the roof of Amaterasu's palace, which caused Amaterasu to shut herself in a cave and only come out again after the other gods basically begged her to return to them. And then finally, Susanoo actually left heaven and descended to Earth. So, upon descending to Earth, he landed at Torikami, which is in the province of Itsumo, which I believe is on the Sea of Japan coast now. And as he was wandering along the river he came upon the sound of weeping. As he investigated, he found 3 figures, an old man, an old woman, and their beautiful young daughter. They were all crying and terrified of something. And when he asked what was going on, they explained that a gigantic dragon, known as Yamato no Orochi, had come to terrorize the region every year, and on every visit ate one of the aged couple's daughters. So this girl, their last daughter, Kushinada Hime, or Princess Kushinada, was due to be eaten by the dragon soon. So Susanoo struck a bargain with them. If he killed the dragon, he could marry the princess. The parents agreed to this, and so Susanoo went about setting up for a fight with Orochi. This is where it's a bit different from many of the other sort of thunder god versus dragon stories, in that rather than just being a straight fight in which Susanoo overpowers the dragon, Susanoo actually put some thought and tactics into this, and he had the couple prepare 8 large bowls of extra strong sake, one for each head of the dragon. They placed them outside their house, and when the dragon arrived, he smelt the sake, couldn't resist, and each head drank from one of the cups until it collapsed completely drunk. And then Susanoo just wandered over and chopped off each head in turn, and the dragon was dead, rather than many of the other stories where there is actually a long battle where the thunder god, gets wounded but strikes down the dragon and emerges victorious. He sort of cheated.
Yeah, it's kind of more of a guile-based hero rather than the stereotypical Hercules hit you with rock.
Yeah, yeah. Whereas, he'd obviously been quite a troublemaker in the heavens, and so wasn't going to become sort of an honest fighter upon going down to Earth, and so instead tricked the dragon. But still, he had actually completed his end of the promise, and so did get to marry Kushinada. He also cut open the dragon's belly, and inside the dragon's belly he discovered the sword, the Kusanagi, or the grass cutter, which he presented to his sister by way of an apology. And then Amaterasu granted this sword to her grandson Ninigi, who became the first ancestor of the Japanese imperial family, and the sword was supposedly preserved at the temple of Atsuta near Nagoya. And so yes, that's one of the major stories of dragon folklore in Japanese mythology and Japanese religion, in which the dragon is presented as an evil creature terrorizing humanity, and it does bear quite a lot of similarity to many other mythologies that we were discussing last time, in which the thunder god faces off with this dragon. And we do have one other example of the thunder god destroying the dragon later on, which may sort of trace one of the origins of that type of story and how it actually reached as far as Japan. But as well as that, in Japanese mythology we get more benevolent dragons, or at least dragons with a more ambiguous nature. For example, one of them is not really a specific story associated with these, but there's dragons called Mizuchi. It could refer to one specific dragon that was quite malevolent. It was known for poisoning people. Alternatively, it could refer to dragons that were associated with individual rivers, and some thought that they would demand human sacrifices in prehistoric times. And then you get other sort of dragon kings with different domains. For example, Ryujin, the dragon king of the sea, who, one story about him, it starts off with him and his daughter sort of rewarding someone, and then becomes a very cautionary tale. So there's a story that I read in a book of Japanese fairy tales, in fact, of Urashima Taro, the fisher lad. And this fisherman boy was walking along the beach finding a spot to fish one day when he came upon a group of people beating a turtle. And he took pity on this turtle. He didn't like the idea of these cruel people harming animals, and he chased these people off. And then the turtle thanked him for his kindness and turned into the dragon princess of the dragon princess, daughter of Ryujin, princess of the oceans. And she offered to take him to the ocean kingdom and offered him her hand in marriage. And so he rode on her back to the ocean kingdom, met the king of the ocean dragons, Ryujin, and for days he stayed there seeing all these beautiful sights of the ocean kingdom, exploring under the sea, feasting for hours
under the sea.
Yeah, he had a whole Little Mermaid fantasy going on.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, I have mermaids in one of my accounts later, so that's going to be fun.
Ah, excellent. So yeah, he lived in this undersea kingdom for several days with the dragon princess, but he got homesick. So he asked the princess and asked Ryujin the king if he would be alright to leave the ocean kingdom. And while the princess was very sad that he wanted to leave all of this splendour behind, she understood that it's not his home, but she gave him, the ocean king, gave him a chest to take with him that he said that you must never open, which is a bit of a strange gift, but when a dragon king gives you something and says, don't do anything with it, you kind of listen to the dragon king.
Yes. There might be consequences to not doing that.
There might indeed be consequences to not doing that. And so the dragon princess took him home, left him on the beach where she found him, and he walked back to his house and called his parents' names, but couldn't find his parents. He asked a passing villager who, this obviously being a small, close-knit village, you would have thought would have recognised, but this was someone he'd never seen before. He asked after his parents, this villager, and the villager said, these people used to live here, but they died like more than 100 years ago.
Oh.
So the several days that he'd stayed in the undersea kingdom had actually been 100 years or more out in the real world, essentially.
I'm getting this subtext that this is a Japanese story about why you should be responsible for your parents.
Yeah, there's a bit of that in it. You shouldn't just want. On the one hand, the dragon princess is rewarding his kindness by taking him to this beautiful undersea kingdom and letting him live forever, where he can just do anything his heart desires. But at the same time, it's warning you: don't just abandon your parents at the promise of riches.
Yeah, remember, kids, as tempting as the Dragon King's offer might be, you have to come back before 8 o'clock, okay?
When the street lights come on, you've got to come home and say goodnight to the Dragon King.
Oh, I remember when they funded street lights around where I were. That was a golden era.
It was more orange. Yeah, it was sodium.
And then some smart guy realised, I can just put LEDs in here. But it's not the same, damn it.
Anyway, the final little twist of the story, being alone in his village that has forgotten him, all his family's dead, and he couldn't go back to the Ocean King anymore. He's like, right, so I've got this chest that the Ocean King gave me and told me never to open, but I have nothing left to lose, so I'll open it. And he opened it, and the chest contained all of the years that he'd missed, essentially. So as soon as he opened it, he aged about a century and died.
Oh.
So there's sort of a few different morals to that story. On the one hand, kindness will be rewarded, which is obviously a common thread in quite a few Japanese tales. The next one, don't abandon your parents, however tempting the dragon princess is. And then third, when a dragon king says don't do something, you listen.
Yep, bunch of relatable life lessons that we can all we've all been through in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah. Yeah, having met several dragon kings and not gone off and married their daughters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was tempting, but fortunately we knew better.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there were some stories where the morals are a bit less complex. Like, there was one, quite simple one, known as the Lord Bag of Rice, in which a local warlord, while walking through his kingdom, one day came across a dragon that was coiled on a bridge. No one else was willing to cross this bridge and risk the wrath of the dragon. But this guy's like, I'm a brave young warrior. If the dragon has a problem, I'll try and reason with it if it tries to tell me not to, whatever. So he walks across the bridge, steps over the coils of the dragon. The dragon doesn't bother him at all, lets him pass. Later on, a young woman comes to him and says, "You're the lord of this kingdom. You crossed the bridge earlier. I'm that dragon, and you were not afraid of me. And so I need the help of a brave warrior like you, because apparently a super powerful shape-shifting dragon needs the help of humans."
Yeah, that's always a bit of a plot hole in these stories.
Yeah, my assumption in this case is that it's more sort of, yes, the dragon could have done it, but the dragon wanted to test the kindness of the humans or something.
I'm looking for a man of true virtue.
Yeah, the humans, since they are, trying to form societies and rule over the lands, the more divine dragons want to sort of test their virtues, I suppose it might be.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, and so for his bravery, she asked him to help slay a giant centipede that had been attacking her people who lived in this lake.
That must have been a great Dark Souls boss, yeah.
Yeah. And so she took him to the lakeside home of her people, and she gave him a nice meal as a reward, and then at dusk, the centipede came out from the mountain, and she said, "Can you please slay this giant centipede for us?" And so he took his bow, and he shot the centipede through its eye, and killed it. And so, for doing this act of bravery, she rewarded him by giving him a never-ending bag of rice. And so he essentially became the richest warlord in the land. And using this rice, he made sure that all his people were fed and was well known for his kindness. So again, it's another story where sort of bravery and kindness are rewarded. This one, unlike the previous one, doesn't seem to have much of a dark side to it. At least, so it's a much more simple moral. In that sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and then there are others where the dragons sort of appear more as a side thing rather than the main part of the story, like one emperor, when ascending to heaven, rode on a dragon and things like that, so they were seen as sort of messengers of the gods as well as inhabiting rivers and such. And like, for example, and then like now in popular culture, some of these dragons show up, like the Mizuchi is thought to be the inspiration for Haku from Spirited Away.
I rewatched that recently.
Yeah, it's a really good film. It's one of my favourites. And Orochi actually shows up in the video game Okami.
Which I still need to play.
Where you're playing as Amaterasu in the form of a wolf. And in this version, Susanoo is a regular human. But he's still fighting against the dragon at your side. And you do actually need to use these bowls of sake in order to weaken the dragon before attacking it as well.
I should have known that you had managed to crowbar in Okami somehow.
I've got to. Yeah, well, that's it. There's still quite a lot of old Japanese folklore that makes it into popular culture these days. Between game creators who make things like Okami, or like people like Miyazaki, there's a lot of old mythology appearing in there that some people might just think it's fantasy, but actually it goes back several centuries to like the original feudal kingdoms of Japan.
Yeah, I think Western storytellers are now slowly starting to mine that for their obviously Okami is a Japanese-made game.
Yeah.
But I think there's becoming a greater awareness in the West of that, and people are starting to tap into that mythology and kind of reimagine it somewhat.
Yeah.
The one which always surprised me is that a lot of kind of Celtic mythology no one's bothered to go and look at that really and say, I could make a game out of this, or I could make a film out of this. Maybe I'm just consuming the wrong forms of media, but anyway, tangent aside.
Yeah. Often with the Western mythology, we do tend to just have a sort of very straight up adaptation of it. It's just another movie about King Arthur or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think I think that's also kind of has fallen into the remake mania of a lot of films and TV these days.
Yeah.
But anyway, moving on.
Yes, before we become a popular culture critical podcast, or whatever you'd call it.
Yeah, where we just whinge about whatever piece of media we've been trying to eke out the days with as lockdown continues in the UK.
Yes. Anyway, shall I hand over to you for your next segment?
Yes. So if that's most of your Japanese dragons covered, we're going to divert back into the West again. So last time we had finished with discussing things like Heracles' encounters with dragon-like or serpentine entities during his 12 labours, which I actually referred to as the 10 labours last time, because originally it was supposed to be 10 labours, and then, as I discussed, he was given 2 more. I've kind of gone through everything I can find mythology-wise for ancient Greece. What I want to just talk about very briefly, kind of an honourable mentions, is in addition to these mythological tales, there are a couple of accounts out there from kind of Greek historians who do directly report dragons as being active in certain places of the world during their time. A lot of the time it's just them passing along hearsay, which there's nothing particularly special about that. You can find that in most of the accounts. But a few of them do say, I went there and saw this. So the main example I want to give of that is Herodotus, who in his histories reports to us that there are in fact large serpents to be found in Libya, and that winged lizards can be found in Arabia. So the exact quote I have here is, "There is a place in Arabia situated very near the city of Buto, to which I went on hearing of some winged serpents. And when I arrived there, I saw bones and spines of serpents in such quantities as would be impossible to describe. The form of the serpent is like that of the water snake, but he has wings without feathers, and as like as possible to the wings of a bat." So, what I wanted to get into with that was, what do we think he could have actually seen if he did see such a thing?
Yeah. So you say he referred to the bones specifically.
Yeah, he referred specifically to bones and spines, and he reported these serpents as being like water snakes, but they had wings without feathers.
Yeah.
The only thing I can really think of is he could perhaps have seen fossils of some type of plesiosaur or marine animal that has fins.
I was going to say, does that completely disprove my dismissal of it could be dinosaurs last time? Because I did say, didn't I? I would have thought there would be more accounts of like temples or kings who possessed these bones, and then you go and find an account of, yes, here's someone who possessed the bones of a dragon-like creature.
Well, I mean, it's entirely possible. Obviously, we don't have anything analogous that we can say it was definitely this thing that he saw. The other thing is often, well, I cannot remember off the top of my head how true this is, but from what I can vaguely remember, I do know that Herodotus kind of reports a lot of things that people just told him as well.
Yeah.
So it's not so sure whether he actually did go to this place. I mean, where he's discussing going is a very long distance from where he lived in Greece. He's talking about Arabia.
Yeah.
So I don't know how based in fact that actual statement is. I mean, there is a reason why Herodotus is also known, alongside his title of the father of history, as the father of lies.
Yeah. I mean, he does claim to have travelled everywhere from like Portugal as far as Arabia, and even doesn't he claim to have travelled to Britain at one point as well?
I think that's a much. I mean, he talks about a place called the Cassiterides, which people thought might have been Britain, but it's more likely that it was kind of tin producing islands off the coast of France or Spain.
Yeah.
I mean, the first true account of people reporting something definitely like Britain is probably Pythias, but I've spoken about him in basically every single video I've ever made, so I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
So the only other, the other quick account I saw is there's also a historian by the name of Josephus, who I think was a Jewish historian who went over to the Romans during their conquest of Judea. And the only interesting thing I have to say about that is that he reports to us that the serpents that Moses contended with in the Bible were in fact dragons.
Hmm.
So that's
Okay.
the only thing I really have to report for that. I didn't look too much into that one, I must admit.
Yeah. What weren't those serpents described as a plague of serpents and like several thousand of them, like running through the streets, if I remember rightly?
I think he means Moses' contention with the Magi of the Pharaoh.
Ah, right. Yeah. Not where he
Yeah.
actually called down serpents from God and terrorized the people with them.
I'll be honest, I don't know.
I'm very rusty on that story. Yeah, I'm very rusty on that story.
Yeah.
I apologise to anyone of Christian or Jewish faith.
Well, I'll be honest, most of my knowledge of that stuff comes from the film The Prince of Egypt, which I saw when I was about 9 years old. So, yeah, I'm definitely an expert and can speak with authority on this.
I'd say so.
Yeah. So, the Romans, in addition to most of their mythology and religion being heavily based on Greek accounts, there aren't that many accounts as we move into the Roman period of dragons. What I found was more interesting with the Romans is the Romans are probably the first example I could find of dragon iconography being used on flags or standards. And this is the form of the cohort flag of Draco, which was adopted, I think it was adopted in the 2nd century CE.
Yeah.
That's going to annoy some people because I've always said AD or BC up until now. It didn't originate with the Romans. It appears to have originated with the peoples of Dacia. So this is the people kind of along the borders of what would now be modern Bulgaria to the north of that region, and kind of somewhat the Balkans as well. And rest assured, we will be briefly revisiting the Balkans when I get into some more unusual interpretations of dragons.
Okay.
But yes, kind of almost analogous to the Roman period, we have, in addition to kind of the Old Testament discussion of Yahweh that we mentioned last time, we have the appearance of draconic imagery in the New Testament of the Bible. So I will admit, before coming into this, I was not very familiar at all with this. I was aware of one particular piece, at least, that was involved in Revelations. But for this, I made the point of going out and actually looking up the individual quotes involved in it. So the image of the dragon does appear in the Bible. And this is really the beginning of where biblical imagery connecting dragons with both the Day of Judgment and with the devil starts to come into its own. So the quote I'm going to be using for this is from, I think it's Revelations 12, which is also known as the Revelation of John. And it's one of the later books of the Bible. I think it was, from what I saw, it was composed towards the end of the 1st century AD. And it was kind of composed alongside a backdrop of increasing Roman persecution of Christianity. So the exact quote I have here will be familiar to people in a few contexts other than the Bible, which is, and I quote, "Next appeared a great portent in heaven. A woman rode with the sun, beneath her feet the moon, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant, and in the anguish of her labour she cried out to be delivered. Then a second portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. On his heads were 7 diadems, and with his tail he swept down a third of the stars in the sky and flung them to earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that when her child was born, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, who is destined to rule all nations with an iron rod. But her child was snatched up to God and his throne, and the woman herself fled into the wilds, where she had a place prepared for her by God, there to be sustained for 1260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels waged war upon the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought, but they had not the strength to win, and no foothold was left to them in heaven. So the great dragon was thrown down, that serpent of old that led the whole world astray, whose name is Satan, or the devil, thrown down to the earth, and the angels with him." So there is kind of I'd say almost a post-amble to this, where an additional beast arises to contend with the forces of heaven. This is the famous beast of the number of the beast, so to speak, the 666, and is explicitly labelled as having the power of the previous dragon conferred upon it. So yeah, that's kind of the origin that I can find of dragon-like imagery being associated with Satan. This imagery is kind of a long-running one within Christianity. I was most familiar for it before this in the works of William Blake, who famously painted an image of this called, I think it was the Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun, which I actually have hanging on my wall next to me as we speak.
Didn't know you had such a collection of art.
I have maybe 2 pieces of artwork in my entire house, and that just happens to be one of them. If anyone wants a fun read, by the way, look into the life of William Blake, because that's some crazy stuff. He was a bit unique, shall we say. So there's a couple of things I want to say about that passage in the Bible. The first thing is that this section appears to be harkening back to an earlier section of the Old Testament. It's kind of deliberately associating itself with the imagery found within the book of Daniel, which also outlines an apocalypse and 4 beasts that are described within, which have very similar imagery. In fact, if you continue on through Revelations, there are more beasts than the ones I described, but I think that's probably about as much depth as we need to go into for that one.
Yeah.
There's one thing actually that I missed out last time as well, to do with draconic imagery found within the Old Testament. So, looking back through the Old Testament, there are a couple of sections in the books of Job. I think it's I never know how to pronounce this. Is it Psalms?
Yeah.
And Ezekiel, where the enemies of Israel are kind of explicitly identified as dragons. So in particular in Ezekiel, I think it's 29:3 to 29:5 and 32:2 to 32:8, the Pharaoh of Egypt is described in draconic terms. So the exact quote I have in the version of the Bible I have, which is a version that was printed in 1970 and is the New English Bible by Oxford University Press. The version I have does not have that imagery in it. However, it does retain a lot of elements from that. So the exact quote that's in my version says, and this is a direct address of the Lord God against the Pharaoh of Egypt, is, "I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster, lurking in the streams of the Nile. You have said, my Nile is my own. It was I who made it. I will put hooks in your jaws and make them cling to your scales. I will hoist you out of its streams with all its fish clinging to your scales. I will fling you into the wilderness, you and all the fish in your streams. You will fall on the bare ground, with none to pick you up and bury you. I will make you food for beasts and for birds, so all who live in Egypt will know that I am the Lord. For the support that I gave to the Israelites was no better than a reed, which splintered in the hand when they grasped you, and tore their armpits. When they leaned upon you, you snapped, and their limbs gave way." So there are a couple of other quotes, but I think that gets across, I personally feel that there's a degree of more crocodile imagery in that, draconic imagery, but as I say, there are so many translations removed from the original version here that I don't think we can quibble over that one too much.
Yeah, some of it did sort of get toned down in translation. A lot of the references to Satan and various evil creatures does sort of get, toned down.
Yeah.
That was a rambling sentence.
Yeah. I think ramble is probably the best way to describe this entire project, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. There's also an addition, there's an apocryphal version of the story of Bel and the dragon from the Old Testament, which is the famous example of an idol that supposedly ate the food which the Babylonians were offering to it. And Daniel, sprinkles, I think it's dust or something to that effect over the floor of the temple and proves it is in fact the priests that are eating this food and not the idol. In one of the apocryphal versions, the entity being worshipped by the Babylonians is actually a dragon.
Yeah.
To which Daniel, and I'm quoting Daniel 14, roughly summarising Daniel 14:23 to 30, Daniel makes cakes of pitch, fat, and hair, which the dragon then eats and bursts open. So yeah, that's a a good chunk of biblical imagery associated with dragons there.
Yeah. So that was in Babylon, did you say?
Yeah.
So was that potentially Tiamat that they were worshipping, that sort of a deliberate reference to proving the old religion of Babylon wrong?
I'm not sure, because I'm not sure to what extent Tiamat would ever have been worshipped as like a guardian deity or something that you actually wanted to appease, given her contention with Marduk.
Yeah, fair point.
I'm guessing it's really designed to not really slander, but pour aspersions on the worship of other gods by other peoples. I think you have to take into account as well that the Babylonians, specifically the Neo-Babylonian Empire, did not have the best relationship with the people of Israel.
Yeah, and
the Babylonian captivity is a thing, shall we say?
Yeah, and there's something that I will be mentioning later, which is very much a parallel to the Israelites referring to dragons in their references to the Babylonians. There's something that I will be bringing up later, which completely flips that round. So
fair enough. But yes, that's everything I have kind of on biblical imagery, and a little bit of Roman stuff thrown in as well. There is another story from this period, or at least that originates from around this period, that I'll go into a bit later, because it actually evolves into a very, very different form from initial accounts from around the 3rd century.
Okay.
So with that in mind, I'm going to be heading over to Norse mythology. So there's going to be a fair amount of overlap, just to warn everybody here, between Germanic mythology, which to some extent predates or is contemporary with Nordic mythology, particularly in the case of one of the examples I'm going to give. Within straight Norse mythology presented in sources such as the verse and poetic Eddas, however, we have 3 major accounts of dragons that I want to cover. Again, in some cases, these are entities which are described explicitly as dragons. In some cases, they are described as serpents. So, the first example of this is perhaps the most famous example, and this is the example of Nidhogg, or Nidhoggur, or however it is supposed to be pronounced. This is the serpent that gnaws at the roots of the world tree. So, despite being quite a famous entity within, I think, pop cultural awareness of the Norse tales, the actual references to it in those 2 sources I mentioned are very, very slim, and its role and relation to the gods is not very well defined from the passages that I read. A basic overview is that Nidhogg is the serpent that lives in a layer of the underworld known as Nastrond. From this particular layer of the underworld, it feeds upon the bodies of the dead. So that kind of suggests a kind of more malevolent side to the creature. However, it is in later passages, particularly in the verse Edda, that muddy the waters as to its intentions. So I have 2 quotes here, and these are the only 2 times it is mentioned in the verse Edda. So the first one is as follows. It is from, is it Voluspa, one of the chapters of the verse Edda, and quote, "A hall I saw, far from the sun, on Nastrond it stands, and the doors face north. Venom drops through the smoke vent down, for all around the walls do serpents wind. I there saw wading through rivers wild treacherous men, and murderers too, and workers of ill with the wives of men. There Nidhogg sucked upon the blood of the slain, and the wolf tore men, would you know yet more?" So, yeah, as I say, that's a pretty malevolent description of the entity. But the second quote is where things change a little. So this is from, this is going to be a disaster, the Grimnishmal, a different chapter of the Edda, where it is stated that from below the dragon dark comes forth, Nidhogg flying from Niflhol. The bodies of men upon his wings he bears, the serpent bright, now I must sink. So this passage is in relation to the freeing of Nidhogg from beneath the roots of the world tree upon the occasion of Ragnarok. The problem is, we don't know what any of that means, essentially. Is he bringing the bodies of men as reinforcements to help the gods? Is this another enemy coming to fight the gods? It's a little uncertain. So that's one of the more mixed portrayals of a dragon-like creature that I've seen out there. Obviously, we have more of a thread, I think you were saying, Crofty, in some of the Eastern traditions of dragons, where dragons are more well-intentioned towards humanity.
Yeah.
This one's quite difficult to judge, I personally find.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second entity is another very, very famous one, and this is the Midgard serpent, which I think Crofty will be quite familiar with, Jormungandr.
I want to say Jormungandr.
Jormungandr? Yeah, either version works.
I could be wrong as well.
Yeah. I'm going by the totally realistic and definitely canon depiction of the world serpent from God of War.
Fair enough.
Which I played recently. So, yeah, I think I have the textual high ground here, sir.
Yes, but you underestimate my linguistic power.
But yes, the Midgard serpent within Norse mythology is a creature that is spawned by the union of Loki. That's a great start. And the giantess Angrboda, I think it is. And it forms 3 different children of Loki, all of whom are prophesied to do evil. So Loki being consistent there. The other 2 creatures being the Fenris wolf and Hel. Hel, of course, being... this is where I really wish I'd looked more into it. Hel, I think, is kind of the custodian of the underworld within Norse mythology.
Yeah.
Or at least one realm of the underworld.
Yeah, I believe the name refers to both the goddess herself and also the realm, sort of in the same way that Hades refers to the god Hades and also the underworld.
That would make sense there. But yes, so each of these kind of have various roles to play on Ragnarok. I think the Fenris wolf is prophesied to devour Odin. And I think in the version, I actually read this a little while ago, I think Neil Gaiman's excellent retelling of the Norse sagas in the somewhat bluntly named Norse mythology, I think in that version as well, the Fenris wolf is also supposed to devour the sun at Ragnarok, which we'll come into again. There's another parallel to this in other traditions of dragons. But the Midgard serpent, that's where things are a little more fleshed out, a little more complicated. So, as these children of Loki are prophesied to do evil, Odin decides to do away with them. So in the case of the Midgard serpent, he decides to toss it into the sea. This doesn't destroy the serpent, however, because it instead grows so large that it encircles the entire world and grasps its own tail in its mouth. Where have we heard that before?
We discussed that last time. In Egypt.
Yep. So, yeah, we're returning to that concept of the Ouroboros that we so poorly pronounced last time. But the significance of this is that, according to Norse mythology, it is prophesied that we know the great battle of Ragnarok has begun when this creature releases its tail. However, and I kind of hinted at this in the last episode, this isn't particularly consistent when it comes to all the stories involving the Midgard serpent, in particular when it comes to its contention with the god Thor. So, there are 3 surviving myths associated with the contention of the Midgard serpent and Thor. The first of these is upon a visit of Loki, Thor, and a person referred to as Faljafi. Oh, this is where my knowledge of Norse pronunciation falls down, which is pretty pathetic considering my surname is literally an Old Norse word. So, yeah, I'm doing great representation there. But yes, so this talks about these 3 and their visit to the giant king of Utgarda Loki. So that's confusing. So this king sets them various challenges, and in the case of Thor, he is challenged to lift what is displayed to him as a small cat in a test of strength. However, this cat is actually a magical illusion, And the entity he is attempting to lift is actually the Midgard serpent. Which begs the question, how did Utgarda Loki get it out of the ocean? But I think if we're going to nitpick these old tales, we're kind of missing the point, fundamentally.
Yeah.
I think that's us being smug contrarians more than a millennia after this was condensed from oral storytelling.
Just a little bit.
So, unfortunately, Thor is not able to lift this cat all the way off the ground, but he is able to lift one paw off the ground, which is presented as a sign of his incredible strength. After this, it is revealed to Thor that, yes, this is in fact the serpent, and it's a very good thing that he hadn't actually managed to lift the serpent off the ground, it turns out, because if he'd done so, this would have broken the laws of the universe. So, yeah, we're all quite lucky that he didn't manage to do that.
Yeah. Thor's always getting tricked into breaking laws like that.
Well, the thing about Thor I find that's quite interesting is Thor always seems to either overreact or blame the wrong person in these stories. So the example I will then give of this is that after this is revealed, rather than being annoyed at the giant king who tricked him, he decides to swear revenge on the serpent. Because that was the serpent's fault.
Makes total sense.
Yeah, so that definitely makes sense. The next tale in which Thor encounters the serpent is when he goes on a fishing trip with the giant Hymir. So this trip starts off quite contentiously because the giant Hymir refuses to provide him with any bait for this trip. So Thor, being the great diplomat he is, decides to strike off the head of the giant's prize oxen, which he then uses as bait. However, this successfully leads to him catching the serpent. So in the version that I read of this, which I believe is the Penguin Classics version of the verse Ada, he then decides to try and strike the serpent with his hammer and get revenge for being showed up before. However, Hymir cuts through the line before he can do so, and then the story ends somewhat ambiguously, because he then hurls his hammer after it into the depths, but we're then told that the serpent probably survives. It's not quite certain. Which then leads us to the third and final story of Thor's contention with the Midgard serpent or dragon, which is it is foretold that he will face the serpent once more at Ragnarok, and that he will finally achieve his goal of slaying the creature. However, after doing so, he will then take 9 steps and then die from the venom of the creature.
Very specific number of steps.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if that's a case of 9 being a particular, what's the phrase? I'm not sure if that's a case of 9 like being a number of great significance.
Yeah.
Within the societies that these stories were told by. It may well be. I don't have any more information on it.
Fair.
So the third and final entity that I have is of a figure that is both more obscure when you look directly at Norse mythology, but is also more significant when you're looking at Germanic myth. He's more of a larger figure in that. This is the hero known as Siegfried or Sigurd. Sigurd being the version in which he appears in Norse sagas such as the Volsunga saga. Whereas Siegfried being the version, at least from what I read, where he appears in what is referred to, very helpfully, as the Nibelungenlied. So, yeah, there are a wide variety of different tales that surround Siegfried. I'm not going to pretend to have great knowledge of any of them. From what I could read, however, the common thread of these stories is Siegfried contends with a dragon, which he successfully slays using the magical sword that he has, and also the cloak of invisibility, which is also labelled, I think, as increasing his strength vastly. So, having slain the dragon, he then bathes in its blood, which in doing so renders him invulnerable everywhere except for a single patch on his back. So, people who are aware of a few different mythologies There's a few parallels going on there. I think this was the first example I could find of a hero bathing in dragon's blood in order to take its strength, at least within Western descriptions of dragons. However, some people may be seeing some parallels between him having a vulnerable patch on his back, between one much earlier legend, and that being Achilles, who famously had supposedly this spot on his heel where he was vulnerable to attack. And the much later parallel that I was aware of is it's not quite the same. It just reminds me a little bit of Tolkien's later description of Smaug as having a vulnerable spot on his breast where he failed to armor by lying on his golden hoard. And Tolkien was heavily influenced by Norse and Germanic sagas, so I wouldn't be too surprised if that's where he got the idea from, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The final thing I want to expand upon regarding Siegfried is the dragon he slays in I think it's the Volsunga saga, is actually described as not originally being a dragon. In this version of the saga, this dragon is a dwarf by the name of Fafnir, who is son of the king of the dwarves. This, to me, we had this example with Cadmus and the dragon earlier, where at the end of his tale, he is suddenly transformed into a dragon alongside his bride. This happens here as well. So, as punishment for slaying his own brother, in order to take control of a golden hoard, which is explicitly labelled as being cursed, I wonder why, he is transformed into this dragon-like creature. So the dragon is then hidden away in a pit which he has dug in order to guard his hoard. This is one of the earliest descriptions I can find of a dragon actually guarding a hoard that I'm aware of. We had the example of Cadmus and the dragon where it was guarding a spring, but this to me is the earliest I can find where it's explicitly a treasure of some great renown that a hero then goes after and has to slay the dragon as a result. So once a day, this dragon drags himself from his cave and goes to a stream where he drinks. Sigurd, noticing this, decides to dig a pit along the route that the dragon follows every single day and hide in. So when Fafnir comes to drink at the stream, he drags himself over the pit, and Sigurd impales him with his sword Gram and successfully slays him and takes control of his hoard. In addition, Sigurd then learns that the dragon's brother, it was his brother Regin, who tasked him with slaying the dragon and reclaiming the hoard. He learns that Regin kind of intends to kill him and take the hoard immediately afterwards. So, in a very typical and straightforward heroic manner, he just decapitates Regin with his sword. So this is also, I think, the first example I can find of any hero deliberately tasting the blood of the dragon. And that's in fact how he learns of Regin's intention. So this is a good example, I think, at least within the Western canon. I know, Crofty, you described within Chinese mythology, people ascribing certain powers to dragons' body parts.
Yeah.
I think this is the first example I found of people gaining the knowledge of dragons by tasting their blood. But yes, so the very, very last thing I have to say is that Sigurd himself meets something of an unfortunate fate. Unfortunately, he decided to seize a treasure hoard which was cursed, and eventually he is in fact murdered. What he basically does is he marries a Burgundian princess, and in order to gain her hand, he convinces the warrior queen of Iceland to marry to another Burgundian noble. However, upon a disagreement between the two queens, I believe over who is to enter a ceremonial hall first, his secret of having a vulnerable spot on his back after bathing in the dragon's blood is given out, and he is eventually slain by a spear. So the actual historical inspiration for Siegfried, it's thought to have been generated by a couple of potential figures. One of these goes all the way back to the 1st century, and the inspiration which some people have pointed to is a figure by the name of Arminius, who was a Germanic chieftain around that time, who led a group of Germanic tribes to the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest against the Romans. Now, that's quite famous because that's where 3 separate Roman legions were destroyed utterly and their standards reclaimed. I think it was Drusus, one of the various Drusus Caesars from Rome, who eventually reclaimed some of these standards. But this is essentially associated with the end of Roman expansion past the Rhine and attempts to turn Germany as a whole into a province within the Roman Empire. Where the parallel is pointed to for Arminius is that he was, upon defeating the Romans, he was later assassinated by the German nobility in 21 AD, who were concerned that he was growing too powerful within Germany. And the other inspiration is another figure, a later figure, who shares a much more similar name than Arminius. And this is Sigebert I, king of the Franks, who was in fact murdered by his own brother. So yeah, those are the potential historical origin points for Siegfried that I could find. They may be related, or they could simply just have some parallels going on there.
So the dragon in this case could once again be sort of the demonization of another culture, essentially, being used as the metaphor for those Roman legions.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we have seen as we said, in like the biblical images where like enemy nations are personified somewhat as dragons or beasts. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was also the case here to some extent. But yeah, I don't have any information on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically everything I have on dragons within Norse mythology.
Okay.
So, Crofty, we have a couple of things we could do here. I do have a couple of stories that are kind of related to Scandinavia, but actually seem to have come from English or British sources. Do you instead want to move on to your next selection of dragons before I do so?
We can do, yeah. Mine's a bit of a journey across India, Southern Asia. Yeah, quite a bit of it. So if you're happy for me to move on to that and then move back into sort of the English traditions.
Yeah, I think we're finally getting to some wider dragons. I think when we came into this originally, we did state, we want to try and do justice to different interpretations of dragons around the world. I think after, like, how long have we been going? Like 3 hours? We're finally there.
Eventually. Yep, and now we're about to go on a massive odyssey through India, back to Babylon, and various other places.
Well, Phil, please begin.
Well, the main story itself is from sort of northwest India, Pakistan. Just as I go through it, you sort of see parallels with a lot of European traditions and a few of the Chinese traditions, and back towards Susano as well. And also given the civilization it's from, and what we know about language spreading from northwest Indian region in like the 15th century BCE, that it could be one of the origins of some of these original myths that then got reinterpreted. So in the ancient Vedic religion in northwest India, Pakistan sort of region, so it's a direct ancestor of modern Hinduism. They had a myth about the king of the gods, Indra, slaying the dragon Vritra. And I think in future we should turn this into a drinking game where every time we pronounce something wrong, anyone who actually knows anyone who knows the proper pronunciation takes a drink. Because I'm probably getting Vritra wrong, and it's going to get worse when we get into Zoroastrianism. So the dragon Vritra, which does share quite a few parallels with Thor versus Jormungand, Zeus versus Typhon, Susano, and later on parallels with the Zoroastrian variant, parallels with Revelations. So it was originally written in the Rig Veda, I think translates as the Hymns of Praise in Sanskrit, between 1500 and 1000 BCE. So Vritra's name means the enveloper, and he was thought to be a bringer of drought, though some interpretations have suggested that he was more an allegory for the Ice Age, because in the story itself, he's imprisoned the waters of the world, and the gods have been powerless to free them, and so and allow the rivers to flow free. So it could be either that just due to the massive drought and slaying the serpent brings the monsoon rains, but a few people have suggested that it could be they were imprisoned literally in ice.
Well, the thing is, Hinduism is such an old religion and comes out of such old traditions that eventually led to it. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some sort of core going on there. If we think the last Ice Age based event being, the Younger Dryas, and we're talking, 10,000 years ago, it may very well be that there is like a core left over from that to some extent in Hindu teaching.
Yeah, things. That's it. A lot of tribal stories could have been passed down and eventually grown into this dragon epic.
Yeah.
So yeah, the hymn itself starts with. I'll read the first few lines just because it does give a very quick rundown of the basics of it. I will declare the manly deeds of Indra, the first that he achieved, the thunder wielder. He slew the dragon, then disclosed the waters and cleft the channels of mountain torrents. He slew the dragon lying on the mountain, his heavenly bolt of thunder, Tvastar fashioned, like lowing kine in rapid flow, descending the waters, glided downward towards the ocean. So it quite early on lays out that this dragon has somehow trapped all the waters, and that by slaying it, it's returning water to the rivers, which is possibly which I think is where the monsoon comparison comes in, because obviously the rivers would have dried up. But on the other hand, the dragon could also represent a glacier in the Ice Age.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see almost kind of pseudo-flood imagery appearing here as well. It's almost like every single culture that had to deal with seasonal flooding has a story based around this.
Yeah, and there's a whole episode's worth of stuff on that. However, in this case, the flood is the good thing. He's restoring the waters rather than the waters overrunning the world. So, to go into more detail, so Indra himself, while he was later on revered as the king of the gods, in this story, he'd not actually been born when the dragon had imprisoned the waters. So the other gods were powerless to prevent Vritra from imprisoning the waters or to slay him. And so Vritra, at this time, the goddess Earth supposedly became pregnant with Indra, referred to as the greatest god of the world. He was thought to have known of his purpose while still in the womb. I believe the quote is, "Much that is yet undone I must accomplish, one that I must combat, and the other question." And this was supposedly said by him before he'd even been born. So his embryo had been taken from his mother Earth and given to the river goddess Kusava to grow, and Indra chose, not that other people chose this for him or it just happened, Indra himself chose to be birthed from the side of the river goddess to literally cut his way out, which might have some parallels there with, was it Aphrodite or Artemis even, who came out of Zeus's head?
Oh, Athena.
Athena, one of the A's.
Oh yeah, all these A people.
Yeah, to think I knew about Greek mythology.
I think the example I once heard was like, this is the equivalent of someone from, say, India having to come to England and being like, "Hey, hi, I'm Morton. Hi, I'm Martin. Hi, I'm Mortar." It's like,
Yeah.
all you white guys have the same name.
Yep, and I've just done that with Greek. I'm sorry, Greece. So anyway, where was I? He chose to cut himself out of Kusava's side rather than be born in the regular fashion, which obviously was rather unpleasant on Kusava and nearly killed her. Kusava's husband, Vyamasa, attempted to murder Indra and supposedly crushed his jaw in the process. However, Indra destroyed him with a lightning bolt.
Where have we seen that before?
Yeah. While Kusava survived just horribly wounded. He had a lightning bolt crafted by the god Tvastar, who was mentioned in that little passage from the hymn. So after killing Vyamasa, and while obviously still only a day or two old, he drank large amounts of soma, which is sort of the Indian equivalent of ambrosia that people might know from Greek mythology. And with Vishnu at his side, he went forth and he slayed Vritra with a lightning bolt, releasing the trapped waters. The hymn itself has the quote is Earth saying, "With great thunderbolt my son hath slaughtered Vritra and set these rivers free to wander." And this does have some similarities with Susano in particular, in that Indra was shunned by the other gods, Vyamasa even trying to kill him, similar to how Susano was kicked out of heaven, except in this case there didn't seem to be really a good reason, because they needed him in order to actually slay the dragon that none of them could slay. Also, he had literally been born yesterday.
Yeah, that's kind of a similar parallel to Marduk and Tiamat, where the other gods have to come to him and beg him and to get rid of Tiamat.
Yeah.
And I think he extorts the high price of becoming king of the gods.
Yeah, that might be it. It might be that while they needed him, they didn't want him sort of upsetting the established order and becoming the king.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a alternative telling later on where Indra has been king of the gods for as long as known history. Well, I say known history, as long as the stories have told, essentially. Since the beginning of creation. So Indra in this case is king of the gods, and it's, I suppose you could say, a much more petty version of the feud between Indra and Vritra, because Indra had previously killed the first son of a sage called Twashta, a human sage. I couldn't find any explanation as to why, but for some reason he had killed this child. The sage Twashta then had a second son by a demon mother, and this son became the dragon Vritra, and Vritra swore revenge on Indra and began terrorizing the gods, terrorizing humanity, killing people. The gods again were powerless to stop him. This version of Vritra could not be killed by any weapon made of metal, and could only was weakest at dusk. And so Indra needed a weapon made of human bones in order to kill Vritra. He approached a sage by the name of Dadhichi, who had spent several years in meditation in the mountains in order to achieve enlightenment, and Dadhichi willingly gave up his bones for Indra to craft the thunderbolt.
Yeah, that's very generous.
Yeah. I'm not sure I'm keen on enlightenment if it means willingly giving a god my bones, you know?
Exactly, or if it means being like entombed in one of those statues that you sometimes see where they look, they x-ray it and like, oh, there's a monk's body inside here.
Yeah. Not pleasant.
No, although I don't know how much of that was done before or after death, so I'll admit I'm very ignorant of those traditions.
Yeah, hopefully Indra allowed Dadhichi to die naturally before taking his bones. But we don't know. That these are gods we're dealing with. They tend to do crazy things.
Yeah.
So yeah, once again with the aid of Vishnu at his side. Both times it mentions that Vishnu aided him, but doesn't really say what Vishnu did. Just sort of, yeah, Vishnu was there. Indra attacked at dusk when the protective magic was weakest, and again slayed him with the thunderbolt. However, in this version, rather than getting something positive out of it, freeing the waters, in this version, the four elements of nature considered the killing of Vritra to be a sin, and so intended to punish Indra. Indra supposedly hid himself within the petals of a lotus flower in order to escape the punishment. Without the king of the gods to run the world was suffering, and so the god Brahma pleaded with the elements in order to stop punishing Indra. The elements agreed, but the condition for them to stop punishing Indra was that any humans who polluted nature would receive a share of Indra's punishment.
Oh.
So it sort of morphed into a bit of a cautionary tale of, don't sin against nature. Just it was a bit of a unusual way around it by having it being killing a demon that's been terrorizing the world.
Yeah, I'm like, so that's kind of like, our gods are, or our gods or the celestial order or whatever it is are not particularly nice.
Yeah.
Because we're being punished for doing the right thing.
That's it. I mean, if it was punishing him for killing the first son of the sage, that seems reasonable, because I can't find any actual motive for that, but then stopping a dragon that's terrorizing the world seems like something that would be more heroic rather than punished as a sin.
Yeah.
But yeah, this version seems to be from a later text. I can't find any sources for this version in that refer back to the original. the original Rig Veda or similar texts. So I think the Stealing the World's Water version is the original, and then as Indra becomes more prominent within the religion and as the king of the gods, his origin was changed in order to make it so he had always existed, rather than being someone who ascended to be king of the gods.
Mm.
And so then it sort of changed into a more cautionary tale of even the gods being fallible, potentially. So then Indra does also show up then later on in early accounts of the Zoroastrian dragon myths, which originated from the same region, the Vedic religion found in Pakistan, and then later migrated towards Babylon, which was where the written records of Zoroastrianism began.
Yeah, I think Zoroastrianism kind of hit its peak during the various Zoroastrian empires from kind of around the era of the Median Empire up through the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes, etc. And then it continued, I think, as late as the I think it's the Sassanid Empire, which was around the time that Islam started to enter and conquer these regions.
Yeah, here the parts that are told here sort of again are thought to originate around about 1500 to 1000 BC, and then the written records begin in the 5th century BC. Although, like I say, some of these stories then sort of predict or are changed over various centuries, and so I think it would sort of start to retellings of them start to decline around the same time as Islam starts to rise, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could be mistaken on that because there was a lot of information to get through on it.
I mean, I'm pretty certain that's a good accurate overview to the best of my knowledge. I'll admit I'm not an expert on Zoroastrianism at all. I mostly know of it being the main religion during kind of the period where Persia was making moves into Anatolia, Egypt, and Greece in like the kind of like the 4th and 5th centuries BC.
Yeah, that's about the extent. That was about the extent of my knowledge on it as well. And so then I did go quite far into reading into it when I discovered that there was this variant of the dragon story that is thought to come from the same source as Vritra, and which then sort of leads into connections with a lot of Europe Christian mythology and such. So in this version, there are apparently some versions where Vritra appears under the name of Vritra, but later on was replaced by a dragon that's usually depicted as 3-headed, called Azhi Dahaka, or Dahag. The names seem to be interchangeable, and there are some depictions of it as a single-headed dragon. And yet, while Indra appears, Indra is also again quite quickly replaced, because he was seen as a god, but a lot of these stories, because there are multiple dragon slayers, it turns out, in Zoroastrianism, they sort of quite quickly get the god dragon slayer out of the way to make way for human dragon slayers.
Mm-hmm.
So this version is also one of those early dragons where it's unclear whether it was a dragon who took on human form or a human who took on dragon form. So there's a sort of parallel there with what you see in China.
Yeah, the people like the Yellow and Flame Emperors.
Yeah, exactly. So the Dahaka part of the name, however, does mean man-like, so that does suggest that it was a dragon that could take on human form. And similar to what you were saying about Satan being referred to as the dragon, Azhi Dahaka supposedly possessed the 5 defects of greed, want of energy, indolence, defilement, and illicit intercourse, which were seen as the opposites of the 5 qualities of wisdom, instructed eloquence, diligence, and energetic effort. And
energetic effort, eh?
yeah. But not in an illicit form.
Yeah, it seems like there's a slim line they're walking here.
Yeah. Yeah, and supposedly because of this, all of this illicit intercourse, Azhi Dahaka was one of the 7 worst sinners. And again, similar to the later version of Vritra, he had a demon mother. So he was associated with or served 2 other Babylonian gods, Arduisura and Vayu, and he supposedly dwelt later on in Babylon. Through sorcery, he had created many wondrous things which inspired people to idolise him, with his intent to use these followers to destroy the world. It's unclear specifically how, but this original attempt was supposedly stopped by preaching the words of the true gods rather than by a heroic act. That was literally the one sentence that it had on that early version. There was no hero tale, it was literally just preaching the words of the true gods turned people back to the true gods and away from Azhi Dahaka. So then there's a second version in which you do get the actual hero tale. He prayed to Arduisura and Vayu for the power to depopulate these 7 climes, or the known world. However, the gods instead responded to the prayers of Thraitonia, also known as Fereidun. Thraitonia or Fereidun had prayed for the power to defeat Azhi Dahaka, and so these 2 gods chose to support him rather than the dragon itself. The dragon had imprisoned the 2 most beautiful women in the world, Sanhauchi, that is definitely wrong. There are like strings of 6 vowels in this word, in that name, and Arinauchi. These were the daughters of Yima, the first human. So Fereidun, or Thraitonia, was similar to Indra in that he was supposedly granted the power to defeat the dragon while in the womb, and at the age of 9 he went forth and defeated the dragon. It's like I say, unlike many of the other mythological dragon slayers, he was a mortal rather than a thunder god, so didn't try and destroy him with lightning or magic or anything. He defeated him by first striking him with a club upon the shoulder, the heart and the skull without killing him. He then hewed him with a sword 3 times, causing his body to break into several evil creatures. The gods then told him to stop cutting the dragon, so that the world would not become flooded with these reptilian creatures, and so in this version, Azhi Dahaka is sort of seen as the origin of many of the evils of the world, by the attempt to kill him, releasing a lot of lesser evils.
That's kind of an element we haven't seen so far then, isn't it? Where, someone through good intentions inadvertently unleashes evil upon the world.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of moving, as you say, back into, like, in our various accounts we're both coming to, we're moving into a territory where there's a little bit of a divorce between the dragon-like foe and it always being a god. We're moving more into more mortal heroes who appear to be more flawed and make mistakes, basically.
Yeah, and dragons being more beastly rather than divine as well, in some of these cases. Yeah, and so this part is where we see that mirror image of what you were saying about the Israelites seeing the Arabians as of the devil, in that Azhi Dahaka is described as the originator of the bad religion, not the 80s punk band. But this was apparently the Zoroastrian term at the time for Judaism, and supposedly these evil creatures were part of what spread this bad religion into Israel, I believe. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of animosity between the different cultures of the region at the time.
I mean, it's kind of interesting to see them, everyone accusing everyone of more or less exactly the same stuff.
Yeah.
Which used to be a much more common element of religion back in the day.
Yeah, almost like we're a very tribal species, and generally don't like anything that's not one of us.
Yeah.
Wow, that got serious.
Yeah. Let's move on swiftly.
Yep, sorry. So, as well as being an early example of the hero slaying the dragon, and it was probably descended from that, like I say, that hero, that thunder god versus dragon story, Azhi Dahaka may also be a precursor to Satan, because as you were saying about the Book of Revelation, there is certain parallels with later texts where Azhi Dahaka was not killed by Fereidun, but was in fact captured and chained with awful fetters in the most grievous punishment of confinement at Mount Demavand, and after a millennium has passed, the seed of dragons, which was supposedly sealing him, will be destroyed, and Azhi Dahaka will break loose from his chains and escape to terrorise the world, devouring 1/3 of men, oxen, sheep, and other creatures, smiting the water, the fire, and the plants. Fereidun and another hero, Karsasp, will be resurrected to combat him, and Karsasp will finally kill him. So yeah, that does have quite a few parallels with the binding of Satan in Revelations.
Yeah, as what I was going to say was just that this honestly, we see that template show up in a lot of later religions, and I think we could quite safely say that most of the modern fantasy genre probably has its origin point here, with the one horrible evil who is sealed away, and oh no.
Yeah, like when we first talked about Satan as the dragon quite a while back, because I'd not read older versions of the Bible and not read much of the recent versions of the Bible outside primary school.
Yeah, 5th edition wasn't very good, was it?
Nah. And so I actually first came upon this because there was a quote from the Book of Revelation used at the start of a chapter of a fantasy book called The Priory of the Orange Tree by, I'll grab my copy, Samantha Shannon. Quite a recent one, which I would highly recommend because it does combine very much the European evil dragons and the Asian, more benevolent divine dragons into the same setting. At the start, it just uses the Revelations quotes of, "And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss, and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him, and keep him from deceiving the nations until the 1,000 years were ended." So there's definitely very obvious parallels there with the angel specifically chaining him for 1,000 years versus Azhi Dahaka bound for 1,000 years with awful fetters. So that might be one of the original origins for how the story later evolved with Christianity.
Yep, it could be that. It could be Robert Jordan basically changing the entire industry forever. But
yeah, let's do that. Let's say that, Robert Jordan. Yeah.
But as we're like an hour and a half into this and we're still nowhere near the end, let's move on.
Yes, carry on.
Is it back over to me? Okay. Right. Okay. What have I got? I've got Beowulf next.
Go for it.
So most people are probably aware of Beowulf in kind of a background sense. What surprises me is there aren't that many popular adaptations of Beowulf out there, with the probable exception of the very strangely animated film that we watched a few years ago, which, as far as I remember, was very faithful to the original story, but we just mocked it because the trailer was, what's his name? Who's the actor?
Ray Winston.
Yeah, screaming, "I am Beowulf!" And we just found that the funniest thing in the world.
Yeah, he was very much hamming it up.
Yeah, we thought that was the funniest thing in the world because we were like 20 years old, and we were like, But anyway, the actual story that this is based on. So Beowulf is a weird example of the story itself seems to have gone through a lot of different developments. It seems to have come from oral histories based around some potential events that happened in like Denmark and Sweden in the 6th century. The problem with it is the poem is literally attested to by a single manuscript. Only one manuscript survived to give us this story. This example dates from the 12th century and is clearly like an updated, copied version. And there's two things about it. The first is the name Beowulf is not the name written on the poem.
Huh.
And the reason for that is there is no name on the poem. It's just, here's the epic poem. The second point is we don't know who wrote it. There's no author listed for it. It's kind of in like a compilation of 4 texts. It's the longest of them, but yeah, we don't know who wrote it. And we very nearly don't have this version because I think there's evidence of an 18th century fire that almost destroyed it. So we're lucky we do have it. Let's put it that way. The actual dragon part of Beowulf is not the famous part of Beowulf. Beowulf is probably best known for the first half of the poem, and this is concerning the contention of Beowulf with the creature Grendel. So, the start of the story is basically that King Hrothgar of Denmark is being a highly successful king. He's having a very successful reign, And in order to celebrate this, he builds a mead hall called the Heorot. I believe that's how it's pronounced. And basically, he and his warriors are so jubilant and celebratory that they anger a nearby demon by the name of Grendel, who lives in the swamplands of Denmark. So Grendel terrorizes the Danes, killing Hrothgar's warriors and defeating any efforts to strike back against it. However, after many years of this occurring, a young warrior of the Geats, these are people of northern Sweden, by the name of Beowulf, hears of the plight of Hrothgar and of the people of Denmark. So, inspired by the challenge and in the typical heroic archetype, he sails to Denmark with a small company of his followers and makes contention with the creature Grendel. So first he arrives and has to kind of go through a feast with Hrothgar and his warriors, where he is taunted and accused of being unworthy of the deed ahead of him. And so he launches a long and boastful description of his accomplishments, and everyone is so impressed that this results in a very cheery and merry feast, which, as it so happens, brings Grendel. So after a long struggle, Beowulf manages to prove himself stronger than Grendel. And before Grendel manages to escape, he tears off the monster's arm. Mortally wounded, Grendel then slinks back into the swamp and dies. After which the severed arm is hung in the mead hall as proof of victory. As this celebration goes on, however, another threat arrives, and this is Grendel's mother, who is angered by the death of her son. So she is explicitly described as a swamp hag. And she arrives, she murders one of Hrothgar's advisors, and then flees back into the swamps. After which Beowulf and his company travels to the swamp, dives into the water, and fights Grendel's mother in her lair, where he kills her with a sword. I think it's described as a giant's sword. And then finding Grendel's corpse, he severs the head and brings it as a prize to Hrothgar. So, if I remember correctly, the version of this that we saw in the film, Crofty, it has a spin on this where he doesn't end up killing Grendel's mother because they kind of go with, oh look, we've got Angelina Jolie and she's got her kit off for this role. And so, of course, Beowulf is seduced by her and goes on to father the dragon that actually becomes his downfall. I think that's me remembering the film from 10 years ago. But yes, so what happens afterwards is that Beowulf now becomes incredibly famous for his deeds and returns to the Geats, where he is reunited with his king and queen. He then hands over most of his treasure in fealty to King Hygelac, and in reward, he is basically turned into a son by the king and queen. And after their death in a war with another group of people called the Shilfings, and a death of Hygelac's son, Beowulf becomes king of the Geats. So he goes on to rule wisely for the next 50 years and to bring prosperity to his people. But when he is an old man, a thief disturbs a barrow mound within his lands where a great dragon lies guarding a hoard of treasure. So, enraged by this theft, the dragon emerges and unleashes fiery destruction upon Geatland. Beowulf, sensing that his own time is limited, he's now an old man, goes forth to fight the dragon. So, with the aid of someone by the name of Wiglaf, he succeeds in killing the beast, but he is bitten in the neck, and the fiery venom kills him. So, it's kind of some parallels a little bit with Hercules there, who died from the venom of the Hydra, and Thor as well, who dies from the venom of Jormungandr or Gander.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, so the poem kind of ends with his body being burned and then buried under a barrow with all his treasure, and the Geats fearing that this will now leave them open to attack. So a little bit of a sad ending there for that story. But what I found interesting there is that's one of the rare examples we've had so far of someone else angering the dragon.
Yeah.
other than the hero who later has to contend with and deal with this.
Yeah, so it's sort of one of the earlier examples of dragons being more sort of part of the mortal world rather than the realm of the gods, essentially, as well, and having having more mortal concerns.
Yep, definitely. Okay, so I have 2 remaining accounts then to do with kind of Western Europe, to do with dragons, after which I'm going to do some honourable mentions, so we'll come to those shortly. So the next account that I want to talk about, again, takes place in Britain. Well, it is written and concerns events in Britain, whereas Beowulf just appears to have been written by a scribe in Britain. May have come across as a result of Viking activity from the 7th century onwards in Britain. So the example I have is Vortigun. So the account I'm looking at here is the account of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote a somewhat mythologized, somewhat being the operative word, history of the kings of Britain. I think it was in either the 11th or 12th century. 12th century, it says here. And what he essentially does with this history is he attempts to build like a mythological background for the Britons worthy of other nations such as Troy, Rome, Greece, etc. And when it comes to the removal of the Romans from Britain and the quite similar chronological invasion of the Saxons, along with the Jutes and the Angles, into eastern England, in his version of these events, the king of the Britons at that time is Vortigun. So, according to the account that I have, Vortigun agrees to meet with the leader of the Saxons. This is a figure known as Hengist. I think in some versions there is another brother as well who is also king of the Saxons. I think it's Hora or something. And after a long debate, Vortigun decides to assemble with them and to settle the matter as to who will rule in Britain in peaceful fashion. However, Hengist decides to betray Vortigun and decides to tend the meeting with hidden weapons. So the example I have here is each of his soldiers conceal a large dagger inside their boot. And at his signal, he says each of them should be ready to attack the Briton standing next to him. So this meeting goes ahead, and indeed, Hengist bellows out, I think it's the word "Nimet our sexes," which is the sign for treachery. He seizes hold of Vortigun, and the other Saxons draw their daggers and attack the leaders of the Britons. And it says that he cut the throats of about 460 counts and earls. So Vortigun, in response to this violence, flees westwards into Wales. And here, after consulting with his advisors and his magicians, they advise him that he should build for himself an immensely strong tower in case the Saxons continue their ravaging of the country and take his other fortresses. So after surveying a great number of places for this, Vortigern settles on Mount Snowdon, which is referred to as Mount Erith in this particular tale. However, upon assembling his stonemasons and attempting to build this tower, they find that at the end of every day, the earth swallows up the work that they had done, and the tower sinks. So, having no idea how this was done, Vortigern consults his magicians a second time. Now, I actually came across this not because of the podcast, Crofty. I came across this because of my research on the Druids.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason being that in some versions, I saw some claims that these magicians are not labeled as magicians, but as druids. And in fact, some of the traits that they advise Vortigern on are similar to, I'd call the Roman style descriptions of druids. So, after the tower continues to sink, they tell Vortigern that he should look for a lad without a father, and that when he found one, he should kill him so that the mortar and the stones could be sprinkled with the lad's blood. According to them, this would then make the foundations hold firm. So Vortigern tries to do this. He sends out messengers, and he comes across a lad by the name of Merlin.
Where have we heard that before?
Yeah, exactly. That's becoming the catchphrase of this episode. So, he is described as having a mother who was the daughter of a king, but no father. So after interrogating the mother, she describes to herself that she had no relations with any man who would make her bear this child, but she did know that when she was in the private apartment, serving as a nun, something would come to her in the form of a most handsome young man, who is described as holding her tightly in his arms and kissing her. After a while, she says he would disappear so that she could no longer see him, and many times, whilst he was invisible, he would talk to her while she was alone. And then occasionally he would come to her, and it is described that he would make love to her as a man would, and in that way would made her pregnant. So, it's in the version I have here, he is not explicitly described as any particular type of spiritual being, but as far as I can tell in later traditions and the traditional life of Merlin, he is described as the son of an incubus, so the male counterpart to a succubus.
And that would be the source of his magic.
Yeah, exactly. So he's taken to Vortigun, and he basically says, yeah, my magicians have told me to do this to you. And Merlin says, just because you do not know what is obstructing the foundations of the tower, which these men have begun, you have recommended that my blood should be sprinkled on the mortar to make the building stand firm. Tell me then, what lies hidden under the foundation? There is certainly something there that is preventing it from holding firm. So the magicians say nothing, and Vortigun digs up the earth underneath the tower and reveals a pool. After that, the pool is drained, and within this pool, they find within two hollow stones, they find two dragons sleeping. So this leads to a very, very lengthy prophecy on the behalf of Merlin, which I will not read because it's about 10 pages. In fact, it is the entirety of part 5 of this account. What he basically describes is the red dragon of the two symbolizes the Britons, and in later narratives it becomes to kind of be associated with Wales, and the white dragon symbolizes the invading Saxons. So there are a whole bunch of prophecies related to this that involve initially the red dragon is subdued and seems to lose against the white dragon. You know, there's all sorts of it's kind of framed in biblical prophetic terms, and it talks about, you know, Britain's mountains and valleys shall be leveled, the streams in its valleys shall run with blood. It talks about the subsumation of the true religion to the invading religion of the Saxons, and all sorts of apocalyptic imagery. But what it's essentially communicating is that the Britons, despite initial defeat, will rise again. And you may be interested to know that this is where the red dragon, like the association of the red dragon of Wales, seems to have begun. So we'll all know that the red dragon appears on the flag of Wales, for example. So I think someone in the comments was trying to be helpful here and was pointing out, I think that there was a red dragon. I think that they specifically said that there was a wyvern on the flag of Wales. I'm aware, obviously, there's some crossover and differences between wyverns and dragons. Usually wyverns are depicted by having 4 limbs rather than 6. So it only has like the 2 feet and the 2 wings rather than a full set of limbs and then the additional wings as well. What's interesting to me is that a creature matching this description does appear on the flag of Wessex. It appears that there were some associations in early times between the Golden Dragon and Wessex. In particular, golden dragons and other dragons appear in the Bayeux Tapestry, which commemorates the Norman victory over the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons in the 11th century. However, that appears to just become a common element of heraldry, which then goes on to inform later appearances in flags and in other medieval imagery as well. And it's also said to have some associations with Arthurian canon. So the example usually given is Uther Pendragon, using a dragon as his crest. Yeah, so... And we're back. Hello, Crofty.
Hello. Sorry about those technical difficulties.
Yes, we just discovered that if you try and record a podcast over Discord on the ramshackle Weasel-based internet system of the UK, And you decide to do this in the middle of the day when everyone is working and is doing all these things on this newfangled Zoom thing, what the kids talk about. You might suddenly have no internet connection to work with.
Yeah, and you also get the risk of running out of batteries on your Bluetooth headphones if you're talking for 2 hours.
So, we're going to blunder on ahead, guys, as if we didn't just spend 3 hours waiting for the internet to come back, essentially. I have a very helpful note here that says, quote, "You were about to talk about St. George and the Dragon, you idiot." So, that's where we're going to be starting off for this point. So, I finished Vortigun, so I'm going to blast through St. George, and then we'll have a few honourable mentions, and hopefully finally get out of Europe. So, St. George is an interesting figure. For all we know, there may well have been a historical St. George. If so, the earliest accounts of such a figure date from around the 5th century. In these accounts, he is presented very much in line with many accounts of early Christian martyrs. So these earliest accounts come from central Anatolia, and they're not particularly developed. They mostly outline St. George as an early Christian martyr who was put to death by the 3rd century Roman Emperor Diocletian, who, I'm trying to remember, I think he was one of the last major persecutors of Christians within the Roman Empire. We have, of course, got Constantine coming up immediately after him as one of his successors. So you can see this is kind of when the tide is beginning to change for Christianity within the Roman Empire. So the actual association between St. George and the dragon doesn't seem to have arrived for another 600 years. This archetype of a horseman and a dragon actually seems to be much older than that, but that's at the point where these details start to creep into the story of St. George. If you want to go back very, very far, the image of a horseman just within iconography does appear in the Balkans from around the 3rd century BC. I think this is the archetype known as the Thracian horseman, and it was somewhat co-opted, to the best of my knowledge, by the Romans. So frequently you get motifs of a Roman cavalryman who is trampling a barbarian of some type. This image continued to evolve over time and became associated with a horseman and a serpent, which then further became associated with many early Christian saints. So the example I found that they think jumped from this saint to St. George is St. Theodore of Amasia. So whilst these original associations with the dragon date from the 11th century, the typical story outlining St. George and the dragon appears in the 13th century. This is an account known as the Golden Legend, and it is written by an Italian chronicler by the name of, is it Jacobus de Varagine. So this account is where the broad outlines of St. George's tale come from. So this account is actually set in Libya rather than Anatolia, in, I think, the city or region of Selene. So according to the account that I found within the Golden Legend, this city was being plagued by a venom-spewing dragon that dwelled in a nearby pond. So again, we have a venom-spewing dragon rather than a fire-breathing dragon. And this dragon was generally poisoning the countryside around it. And to try and placate this entity, the people of the nearby city offered it 2 sheep daily. This then escalated, and it became a man and a sheep, followed by children and youths. And this is where the famous lottery that most people familiar with St. George appears. One time, this lottery falls upon the king's daughter. And whilst the king himself then offers up a fortune to try and have his daughter removed from this, the people refuse, which stretching a bit of the believability of feudalism there, because the king probably could have just been like, no. But in this account, the daughter is sent out to the lake to be fed to the dragon. And it is at this point that St. George arrives by chance. So he actually arrives on the spot before the princess, who tries to send him away. And he vows to remain and does indeed contend with the dragon, which emerges from the pool whilst they're conversing. So according to the account I found, St. George responded by charging at it and wounding it with his lance. After doing so, he then calls upon the princess to throw him her girdle, which he puts around the dragon's neck, and this immediately reduces it to a meek, beast-like state. So St. George, being somewhat familiar to this whole bargaining thing, decides to lead the dragon back to the city, and so terrified were the populace that when he offered to kill the dragon, they consented in turn to become Christians and to be baptized. So upon that day, 15,000 men, including the king himself, convert, and George then kills the helpless dragon. Upon that spot, the king goes on to build a church to the Blessed Virgin, and apparently a spring flows forth from its altar that cures all disease. And that's the kind of archetypical description of George and St. George. I think most people who've picked up at least like a horrible histories book or something will be familiar with that legend.
The version then that we're taught in British primary schools gets rid of a lot of the more questionable morality of it, such as, become Christians or I'll unleash this dragon on you. Yeah, that part's new to me.
I think the first account I read as a kid was it went out of its way to remove the unsavory elements. So George, rather than charging at it with his lance, just throws the girdle around the dragon's neck, and then he doesn't kill it. Instead, the dragon just miraculously becomes a vegetarian.
I think the version we had, he still slayed the dragon. Just, there was no forcing people to become Christians. I think they got rid of the part you said where the king begged for his daughter to be taken out of the lottery as well. They sort of...
Yeah. Maybe
they thought that even as primary school kids, we would not fall for that.
Yeah. And then I didn't look too much into this bit, but one of the leftover bits from this is that in this version, George is then put to death by the Roman prefect of Gaul, of all places. It's like, I don't think that element made it into the kids' stories.
No, it really didn't.
No, it did not. Okay, so outside of my honourable mentions and something else that I literally wanted to mention at the beginning of the first episode, and I'm only now getting to, we are largely done with Europe. So, honourable mentions times. So the first mention I have on this list is the Russian dragon I spoke about briefly in the first episode. This is a creature known as Zmei Gorniech. And this is a three-headed dragon that could cause eclipses by temporarily swallowing the moon. So this goes back to, I think you were talking about with, was it the Apep originally in the first episode?
Yes, Apep in Egypt, swallowing the sun and causing solar eclipses. Though swallowing the moon also does pop up in other tales that I've seen that probably won't have time to go into.
So the next mention on the list is the Wawel dragon of Poland, Krakow specifically. I thought this was worth mentioning because it's one of the few examples I know of where there are relics associated with this dragon. So the basic gist of this story is that it was a dragon terrorizing the local populace, and it was slain by the sons of the founder of Krakow, who I think was called Krakus. So very much in the Romulus vein of naming your city. Now, these bones have been put on public display, and from the very brief account I read of this, apparently they're thought to be some sort of mammal remains from the last 1 or 2 million years. But it is interesting to see people actually saying, hey, look, I have parts of a dragon. And then the final thing I have on the list is Albania. Albania, I would have liked to go into this a little bit more detail, but sadly we don't have much more time. Albania has 6 different levels of serpentine dragons. So, yeah, well done, guys. I cannot pronounce any of these, but I'm going to have a try. So here we go. These different levels of dragons are the Stihi, the Lajubi, the Bola, the Bolar, the Urshaja, and the Kolshidra. Yeah, well developed.
And for any Albanian speakers drinking along, that's 6 shots for you for mispronunciations.
Yeah, that'll be fun. And then the last honourable mention I have is actually the very first known example of a kind of modern dragon, the image of it. So the first known modern winged dragon with four limbs appears on a manuscript known as the Manuscript Harley 3244. And this manuscript is very recognisably contains an image of a dragon. The only difference it has between more modern depictions of dragons is it in fact has 4 wings. But yeah, this manuscript's, Middle Ages, 13th century, shows you how kind of late actually this more modern image of the dragons finally appears.
Yeah, and the 4-winged version did sort of make its way into popular culture quite a bit. There's several sort of video game bosses, fantasy series dragons that do have the extra, usually smaller set of wings.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of variation. My brain is going now to the Gaping Dragon in Dark Souls, which has, I think, 8 limbs. But then that thing is literally split open down the middle like a turducken. So, yeah. So the final thing that I wanted to get into that I mentioned, that I was hoping to talk about right at the beginning of the first episode and forgot, is we started the previous episode by saying the phrase, "Here be dragons." So, Crofty, do you think there are actually any maps out there that say, "Here be dragons" on them?
I feel like the answer to that must be no, because it's become such a common trope that it's a complete misconception and never actually existed, I'm going to guess at. Sort of like a mythology version of Beam Me Up, Scotty.
Okay, I'll put it this way. It almost exists.
Okay.
There are 2 known maps that date from kind of the Middle Ages that have phrases on them very, very close. So the first example of this is a globe that was, I think, dated from 1504. This is a world map that does contain the phrase "Hic sunt dracones." This is placed over East Asia, and it literally translates as "Here are dragons." That's probably the closest example. We have another very near miss. This is an item known as the Borgia map, which I believe belongs to the Vatican Library. And again, in the upper left quadrant of the map in Asia, it has a picture of a dragon-like figure and the phrase, which I am going to butcher, so I'm not going to try and read the Latin phrase, I'm just going to read the translation. "Here there are even men who have large 4-foot horns, and there are even serpents so large that they could eat an ox whole."
That's a big inscription for a map.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big map, let's put it that way. It's really intricate, actually. And I think it's got that a lot of early maps are actually kind of upside down as well, based off where the author was designing it from. Sometimes they're upside down as a result. Okay, so that's everything I have on European dragons. Yay. We're finally done.
Well, we're done with that bit.
Yeah, it took us, 4 hours?
Getting there.
For me to get past that point. Yeah. So, Crofty, it sounds like you're about to burst out of Asia as well.
Yes. So since you're going out of Europe, shall I go to about as far as you can physically get from Europe and go for New Zealand?
Indeedly do.
Okay, so it's going to be quite a short section because unfortunately there's not much written information on account of the fact that the Maori only had a spoken language rather than a written language traditionally. But yes, even in such a relatively isolated island as New Zealand, there are actually myths that can be seen as roughly equivalent to dragons. Often they're depicted more serpent-like, and sometimes depicted more looking like the Komodo dragons that you would see in the Philippines, rather than the sort of winged versions, but they are, in many cases, still sort of equated as the Maori equivalent of dragons. So I've got essentially 2 short sections on this. Firstly, going into the dragon that was involved with the myth of how the Maori came to New Zealand, and then more the sort of tribal significance of these, with a little bit of a modern story in as well. That's quite an interesting one. So these creatures that are equivalent to dragons are known as Taniwha. Like I say, they're often depicted as serpentine spirits, either associated with the sea or with specific rivers and lakes and other water features. So many of the eldest ones supposedly travelled with the Maori to New Zealand when they first migrated from the legendary homeland of Hawaii, which I am wondering if that might actually be Hawaii, because it is literally spelt like Hawaii but with a K in it.
I would be interested if that was the case, because I don't know what Hawaii in the Hawaiian language is actually spelt like.
Yeah.
And also it's a vast distance to sail, whereas going from, let's say, Asia to New Zealand, you've got a lot of in-betweens. Hawaii, not so much.
Yeah, I think the current thinking is that the Maori originally came from more sort of the Philippines and Indonesia, but it is interesting that the name is so close to Hawaii, and also because I have been reading through some of the legends of the Maori, which I think will make for a future episode. I've forgotten his name right now. The Hawaiian god who appears in Moana. I've forgotten his name.
I have not seen that film, so I'm no help here.
I've not seen the film, but I know enough people who've seen it and have mentioned it, and I've heard the song. But yeah, there is the name of a Hawaiian god which pops up in these early Maori myths as well. So that one's going to be an interesting one to research at a later date. Anyway, the actual story. So there was a serpent called Tuhirangi, who became the guardian of what's now the Cook Strait, by protecting the canoe of one of the first migrants, the man who supposedly discovered New Zealand, before the rest of the Maori came across, also in what are described as canoes. And then, following that, once the first group of Maori had actually arrived on North Island, is Araitearu, who also escorted the canoes and became the guardian of Hokianga Harbour, which is a little bay on the western coast of the North Island, not Northern Ireland, and which is where supposedly the original Maori settlers landed before spreading out to the rest of New Zealand. Upon landing, she gave birth to 11 sons, and her sons tried to prove which one of them could burrow the furthest, and they set out to explore this new land through burrowing underground. And some of these burrows are thought to have then led to the creation of lakes or rivers, with the most notable one being one of her sons, Waihu, who is said to have created Lake Omapia, which is the largest lake on the North Island. And so, even today, Maori tribes say that Araitearu is the guardian of Hokianga Harbour and lives in a cave to the south, and that if locals displease her, she can call up storms and wreck their ships as punishment. And so, as the tribes then spread out further through New Zealand, and more of these Taniwha joined them, and either created or chose to live in certain rivers, caves, waterfalls, etc., they each became associated with local tribes. So the tribes Tohunga, which is essentially a shaman, tend to deal with them in order to get protection. They give the shaman warnings and information, warning of natural disasters or warning of enemies and such, as long as they're treated with the appropriate respect in particular demanding offerings of sweet potato. And this is also one of the few cultures that I've found where humans could actually have power over dragons, because if you've read a lot of fantasy fiction like we have, there are quite a few stories where humans will either magically control a dragon or raise one as their pet and such, even though that's quite rare in actual real world mythology. But in this case, the Tohunga of the tribe could perform a ritual using a hair plucked from their head in order to control the Taniwha, although there is apparently almost no information surviving on this particular ritual, because in 1907 the government implemented the Tohunga Suppression Act.
Oh boy.
In order to sort of reduce tribal activity. Yes, the colonials have a bit to answer for on that one. Yeah, although Maori culture is, experiencing quite a bit of a resurgence. There was the famous incident where Coca-Cola tried to sort of capitalise on a resurgence of Maori culture by using a Maori greeting Kia ora, but following it with mate, not realising that Kia ora mate means hello death.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's appropriate. If that's what I think whenever I drink a Coca-Cola. Oh, hello, death.
Yeah, it's about right. It's diabetes in a can. So yeah, and as well as these more sort of representations in the news, hearing more about Maori culture having a bit of a resurgence, it has actually had an effect on actual government policy, particularly the belief in Taniwha. Because, for example, in 2002, 2003, there was a major highway being constructed which was said to be too close to a Taniwha's home. In some cases, the government have been sympathetic to this. So, near the Waikato River, which is said to be the lair of the Taniwha Karutahi, and when the tribe lodged an appeal, the government agreed to divert the road. And 14 months later, in 2003, the Waikato River flooded and would have destroyed the original route.
Oh, that's very lucky.
Yeah, and so obviously to the local tribespeople, this was seen as the Taniwha had warned them, not to encroach on their territory because this disaster is going to happen soon. Yeah. On the other hand, there was a case that was reported that was where the government were less sympathetic. The Nahua prison was built on swampland, where it's supposedly the lair of the Taniwha Takuere. And in 2007, the government admitted that the prison was sinking into the ground.
Oh, who could have seen that one coming?
Yeah, it's swampland.
I mean, you would have thought they'd at least have drained it in advance.
Yeah. But yeah, the local tribes attributed to them ignoring the warnings of the Taniwha.
Well, that's the handy thing about mythology, is you can blame most bad things on it.
Yeah. Yes, you can, can't you? And so this is one of the few cases where modern belief in dragons is still prevalent enough to actually have an effect on society. Sort of how similar to the reports that you hear in Iceland of belief in elves affecting things like planned roads. So yeah, that's about all I've managed to find on the Maori dragons. Though if I find more when reading more generally about the Maori, it might pop up in a future episode. So shall I hand back over to you for your trip out of Europe?
Yes, so Crofty, if you've done with kind of New Zealand and kind of Oceania and Asia area, I want to go over and talk for the first time about the Americas. So there are several different options in terms of dragon-like serpents within Native American mythologies and South American mythologies. What I think I'm going to do is there is one group that is like the big meaty discussion topic, and then there's a whole bunch of other examples. So I'm going to go similar to you, and I'm going to go through the slightly more obscure ones that I have first. So the first example I'm going to pick is from North America. So within Native American mythology, particularly what is referred to as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. So this is a set of kind of regional artifacts and mythologies that are found throughout the eastern US, particularly within the basin of the Mississippi. Within this complex of mythologies, there is an entity that appears very frequently, and it is an entity known as the Horned Serpent. And much like some of the earlier portrayals that we saw of European dragon-like creatures, and even kind of entities we saw in Mesopotamia, this creature is heavily associated with things such as water, rain, lightning, thunder, and calamitous weather events. That kind of ties back to another possible explanation of the dragons as an interpretation of the weather, like storm and weather events that we couldn't particularly understand from a kind of a more modern scientific standpoint, that were then given a more mythological explanation. So there are a few different variations of this creature, and I want to just run through a few of them first. So amongst the group known as the Muskegee Creek, there are two separate of these serpents that are venerated. So I couldn't find that much information about these guys. From what I could tell, there is both what's referred to as a horned serpent and a tie snake. And according to the limited documentation I found, these are sometimes interpreted as being both the same entity and sometimes completely separate. Within this group, however, the horned serpent is largely considered to be an underwater snake, covered in large iridescent crystalline scales. And in addition to this, it also has a special crystal centered on its forehead. And whilst this creature is described, I have an account here by an early 20th century anthropologist by the name of John R. Swanton. This creature is described as, quote, living in the water and has horns like the stag. It is not a bad snake. It does not harm humans, but seems to have a magnetic power over game. So despite it not being ill-disposed towards humans, this crystal within its head is prized for its divinatory properties when acquired. So this kind of ties back to similar ideas that we saw amongst kind of the Chinese dragons, where these dragons aren't necessarily ill-disposed towards humanity, but somehow their body parts are prized.
And that might make them ill-disposed towards humanity.
Yes, exactly. So, amongst the Cherokee, a variant on this serpent is known as Uktena, I think is the name. This is described by anthropologist James Mooney. It says, those who know say the Utkena is a giant snake, as large around as a tree trunk, with horns on its head, and a bright blazing crest like a diamond on its forehead, and scales glowing like sparks of fire. It has rings or spots of colour along its whole length, and cannot be wounded except by shooting in the seventh spot from the head, because under this spot are its heart and its life. The blazing diamond is called Ulunsuti, transparent, and he who can win it may become the greatest wonder worker of the tribe, but it is worth a man's life to attempt for it, for whoever is seen by the Uktena is so dazed by the bright light that he runs towards the snake instead of trying to escape. As if this were not enough, the breath of the Utkena is so pestilent that no living creature can survive should they inhale even the tiniest bit of the foul air expelled. So, even to see this creature asleep, apparently, is to receive death. Not by the hunter himself, but by his family. And then finally, amongst the Lakota Sioux, this horned serpent appears as a more nefarious entity, known as the Unhekkelga, an evil serpent spirit that contends with the Thunderbirds of kind of Native American culture, which I'm sure we will probably end up doing an episode, or at least part of an episode, on in the future.
And if we don't call it Thunderbirds or go,
Oh.
there's something wrong with us. Sorry. I shouldn't be allowed to speak on a microphone.
Yeah, I mean, by all rights, I should never have been allowed anywhere near a microphone, but hasn't gone terribly so far. At least not for me. Probably for everyone else, though. So at this point, I'd like to make an honourable mention of an entity known as the Piasa bird. This is an entity known of from a single mural. It is painted on a cliffside alongside the edge of the Mississippi River. So this is a dragon-like looking entity. But what's interesting about it is its exact mythological role is largely unknown. So the original mural that's been painted was painted on very loose limestone. So the original has now been lost. And it's claimed that it can be still seen in some petroglyphs from the time. But the modern version is a recreated image that's situated a fair distance away from where the original was supposed to be. One theory I saw as to this creature's origin is that it's not really like a major mythological figure. It's just like a painted warning that to any strangers they are entering the local tribe of is it the Cahokian? Cahokian.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
And yeah, that's what little information I could find amongst Native Americans for dragon or serpent-like entities in a nutshell. The next thing I have, however, is I'm going to kind of skip over Meso and Central America, which is technically part of the North American continent, and I'm going to jump to South America because, again, I have a few bits and pieces, but it's not as developed as the Mesoamerican stuff we're going to get into in a minute. So, in South American mythology, there are a few kind of analogous creatures to dragons that have significant differences. The first thing I found was an entity known as the Amaru of the Inca mythology. So, the Inca were one of the most significant empires within Southern America in kind of pre-Columbian and almost kind of coexisting alongside appearances of the Spanish in South America. And their empire kind of stretched across what is now a very large number of modern countries. So their lands now make up Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Argentina, and Chile. Obviously, they only form small portions of some of those countries. So this creature was envisioned as a large double-headed creature. I've seen various different examples of what the heads were. So some examples, they were a bird. Some of them, they were a puma. And it's also marked by having bird-like feet and the tail of a snake. So whilst it is known of amongst the Inca Empire, it is also known of in a pre-Inca archaeological site known as the Gateway of the Sun at Tiwanaku. So this is much earlier, even upwards of a millennia earlier than the Inca, which existed in the 15th and the 16th centuries. And yeah, I couldn't find much more information about this one at all. So that's kind of where I'm leaving that one. But amongst the people of Chile and Argentina, there is another flood myth, which tells of a battle between two snakes or dragons. They are known as the Trentren Vilu, which is an entity known to be associated with the earth, and the Kai Vilu, which is a corresponding entity related to water. So this story is in many ways designed to explain the geography of Chile. So the core of it is that the creature known as Kai, or Chai, I don't know which one it's supposed to be, is enraged by the ungrateful actions of men towards the sea. In particular, it said that he's given them many gifts, and he perceives them to be ungrateful. And as a result, he uses his tail to hit downwards into the sea, and the upswell causes a great flood across the land. His counterpart, Tren, helps the humans to escape, so he turns them into animals. Those who are trapped by the rising waters are converted into birds so that they may escape them. Finally, those who unfortunately had already drowned by this point are turned into creatures known as the Sumpal, which are the Mapuche equivalent of mermen and mermaids. So you see what I meant earlier.
Yes, you did promise mermaids earlier.
Yeah, I did indeed promise mermaids. So may no one say that I do not promise mermaids and deliver. So as the sea continues to rise and rise, Trentran orders the hills to rise in order to escape. This is then followed by a battle between her and Kai Kai, which, after a titanic ordeal, ends in a draw. So the result of this is the explanation for Chile's current kind of mountainous geography and ample coastline. And that's the majority of everything I have on South American dragons as well, or at least dragon-like entities. Okay, so Crofty, I think I'm going to hand over to you then, and we're going to take a trip to Africa.
Yes, we started off in Africa, and now we're back. So yes, last time we went into quite a bit of detail on Apep, the Egyptian dragon, which was said to encircle the world and try and swallow the sun. But there are quite a few different dragon myths and dragon traditions in Africa, spread throughout depending on what tribe the tradition came from. Because we don't want to fall into the trap of treating Africa as one large homogeneous country that some people tend to.
Yep.
So some of them share quite a few traits with European dragons. For example, there are some groups that are considered more fearsome creatures to be slayed, rather than the more benevolent creatures that you see in Asian mythology. But then you do get some which share the more serpentine form and the idea of, as you were saying as well, a magical stone that would give them their powers, and that humans would try and take from them. In this case, rather than helping them fly, this stone gave them healing properties. So if a village was struck by a plague, the villagers would trade livestock, or if they had them, elephants, with the dragon for aid. And there are some accounts saying that people would have tried to open up the head of a sleeping dragon and remove this stone from within their skull without killing the dragon, because if the dragon died, the stone lost its power. So, firstly, I'll go into there's a short story that's thought to have originated in Botswana, in which a princess of the Basotho tribe, named Thakane, was left responsible for her tribe when the chieftains, her parents, passed away when she was young. And so she, for many years, was doing the work of both tribal chieftains and also raising all of her younger brothers and basically keeping the tribe and her family together single-handedly. According to the tribal tradition, when they were of age, she would tuck them into the mountains and train them as warriors. The tribe's custom, once they were deemed to be worthy of becoming tribal warriors, was to give them garments and a shield made from the skin of an animal killed by their father. She prepared gifts for them made of lion skin, but her brothers, being quite arrogant, felt that those were not good enough for the sons of a tribal chieftain, and demanded the skin of a water dragon known as a Nanabolele. These dragons supposedly give off a fluorescent light in the dark. They're always surrounded by a cloud of red smoke, and hunting one was generally considered a suicide mission. But Thakane, because she is determined to uphold her family's honour and determined to give her brothers the very best, set off to search the rivers where these Nanabolele dragons are thought to dwell. She kept trying to lure them out by throwing meat into the rivers, but with no luck. Then a group of frogs emerged and guided her to a point further along the river where there was quite a large reed bed within the river. And an old woman emerged and led her to an underwater village that had been destroyed by these dragons, and they kept the old woman alive to serve them. So the woman directed Thakane to the dragon's lair under the river and gave her a magical pebble to protect her. So she entered the lair and found a group of these dragons sleeping, and so killed the largest one in its sleep, which is probably the smartest way to go and try and kill a dragon if you're a regular human, even if it is a bit dishonourable.
Yep.
Remember that if you're playing D&D. Wait until the dragon's asleep.
Yep.
So the other dragons woke up as she was trying to escape with the body of the dragon that she killed, and chased after her, and she used this magical pebble, which created a giant mountain that these dragons couldn't climb past quickly enough in order to block their way. And when they retreated, it turned back into a pebble, and she carried on back to the village. Here's where it gets a little bit strange, just a short bit at the ending. After returning to the village, the Nanabalele dragons found her again and attacked the village, but were seen off by the village dogs. And yeah, and I wrote this summary before episode 1, and I'd forgotten I'd written this little part, but in brackets after that, I put, really? Some dragon they turned out to be. Because apparently I'm very sarcastic.
I feel like whoever came up with that wrote himself into a corner.
Yeah.
Just pulled a Stephen King and went, yeah, the dogs did it. It was a giant spider, okay? Okay?
Yeah, given that, these are meant to be a tribe of great warriors, and she got the skin of it to show, for them to wear to show how great they were, you'd think the great warriors would have done something. But it was the dogs, apparently.
Yeah. Maybe it's saying something, these boastful, arrogant people are, no better than the dogs. So
that could be it. So yeah.
Have we stumbled upon a moral here, Crofty?
Quite possibly. Although she did still create the armour and shields for her brothers with the skin of the huge dragon, so they may have seen the dogs showing their bravery and strength, but didn't really change anything material about them.
Kind of a thankless task to some extent.
Yeah. Yes. On the other hand, we have a story in which there's a much more benevolent dragon, also said to be living in a cave near a river. In this story, there was a tribal leader by the name of Maxava, head of the Maringana tribe, who fell seriously ill. The words were so ill that he could not even eat his porridge. Nothing his family did for him would help him. However, he'd had 5 sons who were seen to be very brave and strong, and promised that they would do whatever they could in order to save him. His wife, the son's mother, asked them to go to Masingi, the great healer, and ask him to restore their father to health. So the children all listened to their mother's request and decided to send the eldest brother, Nitsalyana, to set out to find Masingi. Now, everybody who visited Masingi was expected to sing for him in order to get him to come out, because he lived in a very deep cave, and so they needed a song that would carry well and would lure him to the surface. So the eldest came very close to the mouth of the cave and started to sing for Masingi to come and heal his father. Masingi heard the song, gathered all of his healing herbs and his charms, and came up from this cave and approached Nitsalyana. However, Nitsalyana saw that Masingi was a great dragon or serpent, and upon seeing this, thought that he was going to be attacked, and being such a brave and strong warrior, turned and fled and ran home. Like so many fighters in D&D.
Yeah, I'm beginning to see a pattern here of these like boastful and able warriors just be like, nope.
Yeah. So when he reached his home and everyone asked where the healer was and what caused him to run home, he tried to explain that a dragon had come out of Masingi's cave, but no one believed him, and they called him a coward and sent the second son after him. So the second son, Matiahume, went to the cave and had exactly the same experience. Met the dragon, ran home. The third son, Muhunguti, set out to bring back Masingi. Again, fled. Same with the fourth son, Malamulele. And they thought that no one would be brave enough to actually bring back Masingi. However, the fifth son, who was apparently his father's favourite, even though he was the youngest, and so the others sort of didn't expect him to be one of the brave ones, said that he'd volunteered to go and fetch Masingi and bring him back. His brothers all warned him that they'd fail, but he resolved to try. Unlike his brothers, he stood much further from the cave, and he sang loud and clear to Masingi, who again gathered up his herbs and charms, and came out through the cave, and slowly crawled towards Zikibana, because this version of the dragon, like I say, they don't seem to fly, they do seem to crawl like snakes or lizards. And he He stopped at Zikibana's feet. Zikibana showed no fear, carried on singing a song for him, and Masingi climbed up and curled around Zikibana's shoulders. And so, with the dragon wrapped around him, he walked home, continuing to sing the song. All the people saw him coming and were panicked at the idea of him just carrying this dragon home. But he walked up to his father's hut, and Masingi used his herbs and his charms in order to create medicine, in order to heal the tribal leader. And as he worked, everyone who had fled crept back towards the hut to watch and saw that this fearsome-looking dragon actually had healing abilities and was working on curing the tribal leader. And so Zikibana explained, this dragon is Masingi the healer. There's nothing to fear, whatever he looks like. And so Marengana, the tribal leader, regained his health and held a feast for the dragon. Masingi stayed for a few days before returning to his cave. He left some healing potions with Zikibana in order to give to his father, in case his father fell ill again, and remind him, if he ever needs more, then please come back to his cave and sing for him, and he'll come back and heal him again. And so, Marengana was proud of his youngest son, and his youngest son had proven that he was worthy of being the favourite son, and this seems to be quite an important message of not judging the book by its cover, essentially, because everybody knew of this great healer without knowing what he looked like, and the 4 supposedly brave brothers fled the dragon, while the 5th one waited and trusted that the dragon wouldn't harm him, and so he was the one who brought the healer home to his father.
Yeah, so again, we've got 2 things. We've got the kind of the moral lesson to the story, and we've also got the dragon he's more misunderstood rather than malevolent in any manner.
Yeah, and actually seems to very much like humans and genuinely want to help them as well. Even if he does kind of like his solitude in the cave from time to time.
That's basically our justification for why we stay indoors all day. Okay, leave us alone, people.
Yes, it really is.
We're really dragons, okay? That's totally what's going on.
Yeah, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So the last story that I'm going to tell out of Africa is from Benin in West Africa, although it also managed to spread to Haiti, and there is a very similar dragon told about in Australia, among the Aboriginals of Australia. This is Aida Wedo, the Rainbow Serpent. Quite a short story. This one is again another origin myth. So she's depicted as a giant serpent with rainbow-coloured scales, and she's a major part of the voodoo creation story, along with her dragon husband Dambala Wedo. And I have the actual quote here, and it's probably best if I just go with the basic quote that I found. In the beginning, there was a vast serpent whose body formed 7,000 coils beneath the earth, protecting it from a descent into the abysmal sea. Then the titanic snake began to move and heave its massive form from the earth to envelop the sky. It scattered stars in the firmament and wound its taut flesh down through the mountains to create riverbeds. It shot thunderbolts to the earth to create the sacred thunderstones. From its deepest core, it released the sacred waters to fill the earth with life. As the first rains fell, a rainbow encompassed the sky, and Dambala took her, Aida Wedo, as his wife. The spiritual nectar that they created reproduces through all men and women, and the serpent and the rainbow taught humankind the link between blood and life, between menstruation and birth, and the ultimate voodoo sacrament of blood sacrifice. It's really most of the information that I could find on her, but generally Aida Wedo is sort of seen as, like I said, the creator of the world, and similarly shares with a lot of other large serpentine dragon archetypes of encircling the world. Just in this case, a much more benevolent form than Apep encircling the world in order to eat the sun. So these two, Dambala and Aida, almost always depicted together in artwork. Dambala was thought to create the sky and thunder and create water, while Aida brought the water to the earth and created all life and encircled the world together. There's a very similar rainbow serpent in Aboriginal Australian mythology as well, though I can't find the name. I can't find the name of it and don't have it in my notes, but it does have a similar story. The story itself goes into a bit more detail of once the animals were created, sort of giving the animals and humans laws in order to obey. Those who keep the laws of nature will be rewarded and given human form, while those who break the laws will be punished and turned to stone and never to walk again, to quote from the source that I found. But otherwise, the Australian version is quite similar to this West African version. And that links to an origin theory that was actually published in the Journal of Anthropology, Anthropos even, Anthropological Journal in 2000, by a guy called Robert Blust, in which he suggests that the origin of dragons within the human mind was actually the image of the rainbow. And his suggestions for quite a lot of the reasons for why you can connect a rainbow to different dragons is that there's a very common link between dragons and waterfalls, fast-flowing rivers, springs where you would get a lot of spray and see rainbows in the sunlight. There is a lot of stories where the dragon is seen as the enemy of the thunder god, and similarly, after storms you do quite often see rainbows, obviously. And connections between, for example, the myths of finding pots of gold at the end of the rainbow and dragons often being seen as hoarding gold. But yeah, his suggestion is that one of the ways that the creation of dragons happened in the human mind was by seeing rainbows at these places like waterfalls where they had beliefs that there was some sort of god, and so using the shape of the rainbow to create the serpent.
Well, there we have it. We have another possible origin.
Yeah, I'll send you a copy of the paper, so you can put a link there if people want to read it.
Okay. So yes, everybody read that paper under pain of question mark. So it sounds like you were close to wrapping up there, Crofty. Do we want me to go over to Mesoamerica for our final installment?
Yes, yeah, I will leave that to you.
Okay, we're on the home stretch, people. Here we go. Okay. I kind of saved on purpose the meatiest discussion topic when it comes to dragons in the Americas for last. And it's almost certainly going to be the one which people are the most familiar with. And that is the feathered serpent. So most people are going to be aware of the feathered serpent through its later attestation in Aztec mythology, in particular through the entity known as Quetzalcoatl, and his Mayan equivalents, I think of Cuculan or Cuculacan and Cucumat as well. So before that, we have a much, much longer history for this particular entity. Now, Crofty, as you mentioned with a lot of the dragons of Africa, I have to be quite careful here because this creature's attestation comes throughout a very, very long span of history. And I think it would be quite simplistic for us to try and claim that this is the same god being worshipped the whole way through. We don't have any written records that prove that. We have differences in iconography between various cultures in Central America and Mesoamerica throughout the period of this creature's worship. So we'll try and give an overview of this iconography, but again, I think it's a little simplistic to say that this is definitely the same creature all the way through. So we're going to start with one of the more mysterious cultures of Mesoamerica. This is a place quite far back in history where we have no written records. In fact, we don't get any real written records up until Aztec times when we come to the Americas from the native populations. So the first appearance of a serpent-like deity or even a draconic deity amongst the Mesoamericans is amongst a group of people known as the Olmecs. This is the earliest known sophisticated culture of Mesopotamia. It appeared and flourished along the edges of the Mexican Gulf between about 1500 BC and 400 BC. So not only do we have a big gap between them and the Aztecs of the 14th century onwards, we indeed have a huge gulf of time through where their culture was active as well. This culture is probably best known for the monumental stone heads that we've found that have been associated with it. One theory I saw out of their identification is that these were stone heads of what were thought to have been Olmec rulers. So amongst the reconstructed pantheon of the Olmecs, there are two potential gods which are dragon-like in nature. The first of these gods is a creature known as the Olmec dragon. This is a crocodilian or draconic being. Obviously, its appearance will be heavily influenced by the American crocodile, which was present throughout this region. So this is a being described as having flame eyebrows, a bulbous nose, and a bifurcated tongue. So we do get the serpent imagery mixed in there with the crocodilian. Now, God 5 of their reconstructed pantheon is a serpent-like entity that may well be the feathered serpent. This is widely cited as being in continuity with later feathered serpent deities within the region. However, we have to emphasize a couple of points. The first being no written accounts. The second point is the serpent presented by the Olmecs is not feathered. However, there is a series of cave paintings in which a serpent-like entity appears from around this time frame. I think it's called the Juxtlahuaca cave paintings, and this may be an example of a feathered serpent. It's kind of difficult to tell. For a more unambiguous example of the feathered serpent, we must turn to a major city-state well past the peak of the Olmec society. So this is a nation, state, that quite a few people are going to be familiar with. So I very helpfully wrote down the pronunciation for this. I'm hoping that what I wrote was correct. So this is the city of Teotihuacan. This is a city-state north of modern Mexico City and what used to be kind of Lake Texcoco. That, according to what I could find, existed from around the middle of the first millennium BC through to the 7th and 8th century, where it finally came to an end. So during its absolute peak, during the 4th and 5th centuries AD, this city had a population of some 100,000 to perhaps 250,000 denizens, which would have made it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. So I have a note here that says, for a long time, a lot of what was thought about this particular site came through the lens of Toltec and Aztec mythology. However, there has been kind of some pushback against this from what I can tell, where it's difficult to attest later traditions to communities and areas which may not have that much overlap. So it is within this society that we see examples of the feathered serpent. The best example of this is the eponymous Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent. This is one of the large pyramids found within the central districts of the city. And there's been a few interesting findings here associated with some excavations that have been done. So, from what we can tell looking at this pyramid, there are indeed bodies that have been unearthed from within the pyramid. It's thought that some of these may have served as foundational deposits. And in addition to this, there is an ancient tunnel that runs underneath the pyramid, and according to the source that I found, has been found to contain what were described as human skin fragments. So that's slightly ominous. We do know that worship within Teotihuacan did include elements and forms of human sacrifice. The theories I saw were that these were likely human sacrifice of enemy warriors captured in battle. I couldn't find much more information on this, but the ritual executions that this involved appears to have included beheadings, having their hearts gouged out, and multiple blows to the head. So it's not 100% certain whether the feathered serpent found within the iconography of this pyramid was indeed worshipped by human sacrifice, but we can probably say that human sacrifice was an element of worship at this city. So after the fall of Teotihuacan in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, the feathered serpent became more associated with a later society known as the Toltecs. These are known for being somewhat of a kind of precursor to the Aztecs, and indeed the city of Cholula, which was conquered by the Toltecs around 1200 AD, became known as the principal site of the feathered serpent, where it remained as a powerful city, even after eventual takeover by the Aztecs. And now what's interesting to me is the central pyramid within this city is in fact the largest in all of the Americas. And it is thought that this is where we get the first explicit worship of the feathered serpent under the name of Quetzalcoatl. So this figure appears far more substantially within the mythologies of the Aztecs. And indeed, if anyone knows the quite limited information that we are given within at least English, the English schooling system when it comes to the conquest of the Aztecs by the Spanish, Quetzalcoatl is probably familiar to the people through those accounts. This figure, as I mentioned, is also known within the Mayan cultures. So these are the people who dwelled further along what is now modern Mexico, kind of within the Yucatan Peninsula. This is further east. And within these various cultures, Quetzalcoatl is venerated as, again, the god of wind and the god of air. He's also considered to be associated with merchants, the arts, learning, and I think he is also considered to be a direct personification of the morning star. Within this mythology, he is also presented variably within the figure of the feathered serpent and as a human. So many of the later iconography that we'll see associated with him, he is, as with many of the Aztec gods, he is in fact presented as a human-like figure, where he is marked out in particular by his wearing of a conch shell talisman. I'm not going to go into a detailed description because the Aztec gods are really quite unique when it comes to all the variability and details of their depictions, and I would recommend to anyone listening to go away and look it up because I think it's a really cool artistic element to their society that probably doesn't get enough interest. So the actual god himself has a few different mythologies and origin stories. Generally, he is considered to have created mankind within the Aztecs' current cycle of their mythology. And to end this on a fairly classy note, in addition to inventing books, the calendar, and being the giver of maize to mankind, he is claimed to have made mankind using, amongst other things, blood drawn from his genitals.
People really like using that as an origin, don't they?
Yep. I saved the best for last. So, yeah, that's most of what I have to say about the feathered serpent. I'm being deliberately reticent because I think we'll probably go into a more detailed episode at some point on the Aztec mythology as a whole. So that's a bit of a taste for a potential future episode, Crofty.
Yeah, that's going to be good.
So we have been going for something like 2 hours and 50 something minutes when we take away all the stuff where we were just like saying, "Can you hear me?" So I think we should call a halt to this very swelteringly hot day. If only it would end when I press the stop record button.
Yeah, we can hope.
We can hope. So, Crofty, I don't know about you, but I like to end these episodes by plugging everything that I do. So, in addition to this podcast, I also have a YouTube channel named The Histocrat. Here you can find a number of different videos on all different types of world history. I'm slowly expanding out, and my next video, I think, is going to be on the very origins of civilization.
Ooh.
In addition to this, I also have a Twitter account. I am rather simply _Histocrat on Twitter. And I also run a small Patreon, which I use to fund various improvements and artwork for the channel. So thank you all for your support and for the many patrons. I now have enough patrons that I can't fit on a single screen and have their names be nice and visible. So thank you, everybody.
You've hit the big time now.
Yes, I have double digits of people paying attention to the stuff I do. So, Crofty, anything for you to plug?
Nothing that I can seriously plug at this stage still, no. I remember jokingly mentioning at the start of the episode my playing the ukulele in pubs, and, you know, if you want to look up the last minute winners, there are a few videos of me playing Living Next Door to Alice on a ukulele, but nothing for, you know, serious history fans, unfortunately. Nothing as prolific as your history series is.
Well, I think prolific's the wrong word to use. I've released, 3 videos so far this year? But yeah, hopefully that will improve in the near future. So, thank you for being here, Crofty. Thank you for everyone else for listening. And hopefully we'll do something else soon. Do we want to give any hints as to what our next episode might be on?
I think we should give a small hint, yes.
Okay, well, in that case, I will say we're going to be revisiting a topic, or at least something connected to a topic I covered in this video. So that'll leave you guys guessing.
Answers on a postcard, please.
Yeah, answers on a postcard. I was amazed to find out people still send postcards in my family recently.
Wow.
Yeah, I thought that died out with the dinosaurs, but...
Stuck in the 90s.
Yeah. Oh, do you remember when you'd send postcards and then you get home and you get home before postcards?
Yeah.
Yeah. Relatable, humorous anecdote for people born in the 90s there. Okay, right. It's over. Goodbye.
Goodbye.